Bonjour à toutes et tous, bienvenue. Nous sommes donc aujourd'hui réunis pour faire la conférence de thèse de Maëlis Kervellec, qui va nous parler de ses travaux destinés à Connectivity of Course Scales, Challenges and Opportunities of Hierarchical Modeling and Non-invasive Monitoring. Donc le jury est plusieurs invités. Je vais commencer par présenter. Sarrazin, je suis professeur d'écologie sur l'université. Nous allons présider ce jury. Et ce jury est composé de plusieurs intervenants, donc deux rapports Angela Fuller, qui est professeure à l'Université de Cornell, aux États-Unis. Céline Claudel, qui sera en connexion visio, qui est professeure à l'Université Paris en Sorbonne. Et puis nous aurons ensuite plusieurs examinateurs. Donc, Richard Bischoff, qui est professeur à la Norwegian University of Life Science. Également Aurélie Coulon, qui est maîtresse de conférence au Muséum national d'histoire naturelle. Cécile Vampé, qui est chargée de recherche à l'OSD, à l'Office français de la biodiversité. Et puis nous avons bien sûr les encadrants de la thèse, donc Olivier Ginès, directeur de recherche au CNRS, ici même, en fait, et Cyril Miret, qui est postdoctorant à également la Norwegian University of Life Science. On vous fait cette petite introduction en français pour que ce soit compréhensible pour tous, mais toute la présentation et la discussion sera en fait. Maëlis,
So, hello everybody, thank you for being here today. So today I'm going to present you my PhD work entitled Connectivity Across Scales, Challenges and Opportunities of Hierarchical Modeling and Non-invasive Monitoring. But before we dive into the theory, let's take a look back at what Montpellier looked like 70 years ago. And this is where we are today in this amphitheater that was not yet constructed. We can only see the wing A from the left that was constructed at that time. And this is what Montpellier looks like now. More or less the work to construct the tram line 5 that will probably encounter on the way here. And this transformation is not unique to Montpellier. It's a reflection of land use changes reshaping the landscape around us. Urban areas are expanding, new transport infrastructure are sprawling across the landscape. And according to the last IPBES report, it's 75% of land surfaces that have been severely modified by human activities. And these land use changes not only contribute to habitat loss for wildlife population, but also lead to smaller habitat patches that are more and more isolated from each other, and what we call landscape fragmentation. And the problem with this landscape fragmentation that is impacting the movement of species from day to day to multiple generations, and also from local patches to regions. At local patches and over short time scale, species need to find a resource to feed. Over time, they need to be able to move, to find a place to live, meet potential mates, and then pass on the gene to future generations. Usually, short-term needs like accessing to food occurs at a small spatial and temporal scale, while long-term needs like gene flow or adapting to environmental changes need a much more large area. But we need to first define what we mean when we use the term landscape connectivity. Landscape connectivity was first defined by Philip Taylor and colleagues in 1993 as a degree to which the landscape facilitates or impedes the movement between resource patches. A later definition offered by Kimberly Weave and colleagues refers to it how our species are able to move through elements of the landscape. In both definitions, they highlight three key elements. The landscape connectivity is all about movement. Second, that it depends on landscape structures and configuration. And then that it aims to quantify how movement and landscape are related. And because landscape connectivity is crucial for linking species to habitat and essential for wildlife persistence, is getting significant attention from both scientists and policymakers. On one end, there is a growing body of research that use the term landscape connectivity. And as well, there is a lot of tools and methods that are developed to measure it. And on the other hand, it is globally emphasized like committing to the Commonwealth Global Biodiversity Framework, for instance, but also as well as locally, it is built landscape management plans, such as the Tram Verte Bleu in France, which aim to create green and blue corridors in the landscape. So whether it's for understanding how species are able to move through the landscape or to in a landscape increasingly shaped by human activities, or whether it is to predict movement paths to be able to find a place to put a wildlife crossing, there is a growing interest to answer to the question how to measure landscape connectivity. And this issue of how to quantify landscape connectivity was at the core of my PhD. And to guide you through this presentation, I will start by just outlining the challenges of current connectivity approaches. Then we'll take a step back to just present to you what is the Pyrenean vulnerable population and why connectivity is important for this population. Then I will present to you the opportunities of a hierarchical model in this context. So it will take some time before I will have the time to come to the 3 chapters of my PhD. And finally, we'll wrap it up with some discussions. So let's get started with how to quantify landscape connectivity. Let's start with an example. Let's imagine that I have to compute the distance between my home and my work. An easy way would be to compute the straight line distance as flight prose, which here is just 400 meters. But it's not quite realistic because I can't fly and I have to follow straight to come to work every day. So the path I take every day to come to work is much more longer. Similarly, when you need to quantify landscape connectivity for wildlife, the challenge is to identify the paths that the species actually use to have a realistic measure of what is accessible to them. And usually, landscape and connectivity analysis are composed of 3 steps. First, we need to identify which components of the landscape are affecting movements. This could be the forest patches, for instance, or the cities, the roads. And then the second step is to try to combine all these elements of the landscape into a single cost layer, which represents the cost to cross each feature of the landscape. And determining this cost of each pixel is quite challenging. And it ultimately impacts all the conclusions that we draw at the end of the analysis, so it's a key issue. And there are several methods to do so, and I will just present to you two methods. The first is to use expert opinion, so you can ask to some people with experts with knowledge on species ecology, what is the cost of each landscape features? Or you can use GPS data, is when you put GPS color to some individual in the population and you follow their movement path. However, each of these input data has its own limitations. And the first is that because expert opinion, they are not really reflecting movement paths, because usually it's where the species actually live and not really reflecting the cost of movement. The second is that GPS data are only used for a part of the population. So we need to assume that they are representative for all the population, and a lot of the time we don't really account for that. The third step is to be able to transform this cost layer into a network to enable transition between pixels. So what is a network? A network is composed of 2 things: the nodes, which are the center of each pixel, and the edges that links the nodes to the neighboring cells. And to give a cost to edges, usually what we do is that we compute the average of the 2 linked pixels, and we do the same for all the edges into the network. And this is how we have the cost of movement, of transition between each pixel in the landscape. And from this network, we can apply various connectivity algorithms to measure the distance between 2 locations in the landscape. One example is to use the least cost path distance. In ways, it is when you compute all the possible paths throughout the landscape, and you keep the one with the minimum value. They make 2 major assumptions. The first assumption is that individuals are omniscient. This means that they know and they use the optimal path to link these two patches. And the second assumption is that only one best path exists to link these two pages. There is other connectivity algorithm like circuit theory, So in this method, in circuit theory, they treat the network as an electrical circuit when each edge represents an electrical resistance. And then you can simulate a current flow throughout the network, and this highlights possible paths to join the two patches. And measure, they assume that individual follows a random walk, and that multiple paths are possible between the two patches. Usually, we can use a commute time distance to measure the proximity between the two patches. And this commute time distance, they assume that it is the time that the random walker would take to join the two locations and come back again. At this point, we have identified three challenges of current connectivity approaches. The first is that we need a method that accounts for imperfect detection. This means that we are not able to detect all the individuals in the population. The second is that we need a method that is unable to estimate cost from biological data. And third, that we need a method that needs to propagate the uncertainty through the analysis. And this last point is especially challenging because most of the time, the cost is estimated in a separate step from the computation distance, from distant computation, preventing us to propagate the uncertainty throughout the analysis. And seeing how this uncertainty in cost estimate affects the connectivity might, at the end, impact the conclusions that we will draw. In particular, we need methods for being able to address these three challenges, and this is particularly critical for large carnivores that have been persecuted for centuries and now are recognizing a human-dominated landscape. So let's take a step back from the method for a moment and focus on the history of the Pyrenean brown bear population and why estimating connectivity is crucial for this population. So the brown bear population is located here in green at the border between France and Spain. And if we go back to 1995, the population almost gets extinct, with 5 individuals remaining in the valley of Alps and Osso. And to avoid the population extinction, 3 individuals were translocated from Slovenia to Mel between 1996 and 1997. And this translocation split the population into 2 nuclei, the historical one in the west and the translocated one in the west. In total, it is 11 bears that have been translocated into the Pyrenees. And thanks to all these efforts, this population is increasing with 83 individuals that have been detected last year in the Pyrenees. However, due to its history, the population remained quite divided into 2 nuclei, and they are still trying to recognize this habitat fragmented by human activities. And therefore, we need to understand whether these individuals have access to enough resources, and also if exchange of individuals is possible between these 2 nuclei. This brings us back to answer to this question, we had access to the extensive monitoring of the population, which in France is carried out by the French Biodiversity Agency through the brown bear networks. And the monitoring is also carried out in Spain by each region as well as in Andorra. So on this map, you can see the distribution of the air stank and the camera trap in the Pyrenees, represented here by the black crosses. And the camera trap are mainly aimed to identify reproductions, while the air stacks, which are wires that are placed on the trees, aim to provide an air sample because bears used to scratch their back on these wires. So with genotyping this air, we are able to identify bears individually. And each trap is sampled once or twice every month from May to November, and they provide clues of where each individual is living. So, which brings us back to our challenges. And in particular, to the second one, which is estimated movement cost from biological data, because the biological data we have access now is mainly non-invasive monitoring data. So we have to find the methods that enable to estimate movement costs, but from non-invasive monitoring data. And this is where the hierarchical model comes into play, because they are particularly suited to address the 3 challenges that are presented to you, and also because they are particularly suited for the monitoring of large carnivore populations. So, what's a hierarchical model? So, let's take a landscape and imagine that we have 2 individuals living in this landscape. Throughout the year, they use some area that we will call their home range. And the center of this home range is called the activity center. In general, we assume that the space used is circular and that individuals spend most of their time close to their activity center, which means that the highest probability to detect them is close to the activity center, and then this probability decreases as we go further from it, which gives us this bell-shaped curve depicting the space use of brown bear throughout the year. Therefore, we can take an array of traps, here they are represented by the black crosses, and the bear can be detected within its home range. So for instance, here, the brown bear in blue was detected throughout the survey at 3 traps, for instance. Whereas a brown bear in orange was not detecting at all during this survey, and it's what we call imperfect detection because all the individuals in the population wasn't detected. However, as you can see here in this model, we don't account for the landscape structure and how it will affect the movement of individuals throughout the year. So, and in reality, the home range is unlikely to be circular and it must be impacted by the presence of barrier. So how to account for this cost on brown bear movements? If we zoom in the space use part of the model, at the moment where we compute the distance between the activity center and the trap, what people usually do is that they use the Euclidean distance to compute this distance, which, by the way, is the same between the trap 15 and the activity center and the trap number 31 and the activity center. But as I said before, the straight line distance is not representing actually the movement path of individuals. So we can account for the fact that there is an increasing cost as we go closer from this road and replace this Euclidean distance by a least cost path distance, which reflects the true accessibility of traps by the brown bear. And we realize by doing that the trap number 15 is much further away for this bear than the trap number 31. But you're probably going to say to me that's all well and good, but you are not estimating the costs based on biological data. And precisely, this is where we can add a parameter that is estimating by the model, which can tune the values of the resistance surface. For instance, if the landscape has no impact of brown bear movement, this parameter that will be estimated, this is the cost value, will be equals to 0. And therefore, each pixel in the resistance surface, this cost layer, we have a value of 0. And as you can see, here the least cost path distance equals to the Euclidean distance. However, if we increase this cost value to 1, you can see that the value of the pixels are increasing, as well as the distance between the traps. And this distance is especially bigger when the individual has to cross this road. And you can still increase the value to 2, for instance, and you can see both the value of the resistance surface and the distance are still increasing. And because we are estimating both the cost value and the location of activity center in the same model, we are able to propagate the uncertainty throughout the analysis and able to provide uncertainty maps along with the connectivity estimates. And all of my PhD work was to explore new methodological developments in this model to investigate multi-scale processes. And in particular, we try to understand to which extent the human infrastructures restrict large caliber movement across scales. And if you remember the graph that I presented at the beginning of the presentation, we can place each chapter right into it. First, chapter 1, we are looking at resource access to answer to the question, does road density restrict brown bear space use? Then, in chapter 2, we will move up to the level of demographic exchange to look at 2 major roads restricts brown bear interannual home range movements. And finally, in chapter 3, we move on to another case study, which is the Eurasian links. And we are looking at those 2 major roads restrict Eurasian links recolonization. And each of these questions brings methodological development that I will introduce in each of the chapters. So let's move on to the chapter 1. Does the road density restrict the brown bear species. For this study, we use an independent data set of 1 year, which are capture data at the scale of the Pyrenees, and we try to understand to answer to two underlying questions, which are all the bears in the population equally impacted by the presence of rows? And the second question was, is the existing monitoring of the population allow us to estimate this cost value? So in addition to the systematic monitoring of the population, we also get a sign of brown bear presence through depredation events. And because we don't have access to where the livestock in the Pyrenees are, we use all the depredation events since 2010 as a proxy for where the livestock is in the Pyrenees. And we aggregated them into a 5-kilometer grid, which gives us this kind of traps. In other words, we assume that the sheep flocks are our traps, and that the detection occurs since one bear attacks a sheep flock, we detect this depredation, and we detect the bear responsible of these damages. And by integrating this depredation data into the model, we are able to detect more bears and also to have more spatial recaptures of the bears. And when we look at the input data, we can see that most of the population is located here at the border between Ariège and Catalonia. You see here is for the females, but we have also a kind of a map for the male. And we are surprised that two individuals, called Nere and Goyat, seems to have a larger space use than the rest of the population, because as you can see here, the links here link the one detection event to the centroid of their detections. So you can see here that this individual seems to have much more larger space use than the rest of the population. So we place them into another category that we have called outliers individuals. So there are two males in the population with different space use than the rest of the population. And to answer to this question, we use kind of the same model with two major differences. The first is that we allow for differences in the detection probability between the two monitoring, the systematic one and the opportunistic one. And also, we allow to estimate specific cost value for each group in the population. And we obtain this kind of results. So here you can see the distribution of the estimated parameter. The point in the middle is the median, which means that there is 50% of the distribution above this value and 50% of the distribution under this value. And you also have the 95 credible interval, which encompasses 95% of the total distribution. And what we're actually interested in is that this interval doesn't cross zero. This means that the landscape has an impact on brown bear space use. And also this cost is negative, which means that the more there is the road density, the highest the cost movement will be. We were also able to have cost estimate for the males, as well as for the two outliers. And you can see here that for the two outliers, the road density doesn't seem to impact their space use throughout the year. And because we had also access to the activity center location for each individual, we are also able to map their space use according to where they are living. For instance, if there is an individual living here in this area with not much road density, you can see that its space use is quite circular, and the higher space use of the darker color are in the middle, quite close to this activity center, and then the space use decreases as we go away from the activity center. However, if there is an individual living close to this area with much more road density, you can see that its space use is much more affected by the road. And in this case, this space use is shaped by the presence of roads. But we are also able to sum up for all the females in the population to have access to population level space use maps. So we can see here that the main part of the population is living here. So the higher space use is in this part of the Pyrenees between Ariège and Catalonia. But we were quite surprised with this result because this map also showed a high space use here in the Parc National de Ordesa in Montperdido. And we are quite surprised because from what we know, there is no bears living there. And because there is no monitoring in this part of the area, the model assumed that there was activity center there because they believe that the habitat was suitable there. And then they assumed there was quite spacious, a lot of spaces. However, because we were able to also have the uncertainty map, we are also able to see that in this area, the uncertainty is also high. So we are able to decipher when the model was quite sure about its estimates and when it wasn't. We are also able to provide the same kind of map for the males, which here. And as you can see, the uncertainty map is much lower for the males. We are also able to provide the map for the two outlier individuals, but in this case, the uncertainty is too high to be able to say something. So to sum up for this chapter, we are able to have an explicit estimation of cost from cultural capture data with associated uncertainty for this population, which was quite new. We are also able to make the most of the existing monitoring of the population because we are able to integrate both the systematic monitoring of the population and the opportunistic data from depredation events. And finally, we are able to identify differences in connectivity among males, with these two individuals having different space use than the rest of the population. However, in this chapter, we estimate the values independently for each year. We didn't share information in the monitoring between years. So to achieve that, we wanted to move on to a larger scale to answer to the question, do major roads restrict brown bear interannual home range movements? So for this chapter, we are more at the demographic scale of the study, and we use a 5-year data set from 2017 to 2021, and we are still located at the scale of the Pyrenees. And here we wanted to develop an open population spatial capture cutting models. This just means that it is open demographically, that allows for recruitment in the population and death of individuals, and also allows us to look at movements of activity center between the Earth. And this is the part where we are most interested in. If we just take a look at the data, we can see here from previous analysis the movement of activity center across the years. So you can see that they are able to move between years. And this is when we add the layer of roads, major roads in the Pyrenees. And as you can see here, this major road seems to frame the population. And we wanted to look more deeply in this part. So what the model looks like. It starts from the same model as I presented before, but now we have one model for each year. And between the year, we have different capture history, and the individuals are able to move between the year. And we want to know what impacts the movement of the activity center between the years. What people usually do is that they estimate the location of the activity center the first year, and then the following year, they assume that the activity center will be in some neighborhood around the activity center the first year. And therefore, we were able to know the activity center, to estimate the location of the activity center the following year. However, in this model, they do not account for the fact that the barrier may impact the movement of activity center between years. And therefore, in the same way as before, we replace the Euclidean distance in the model by a least cost path distance, allowing us to estimate the cost of landscape on brown bear activity center movement between years. And this is what the results looks like. Here you can see that both credible intervals are not crossing zero, meaning that there is an impact of the distance to the road on activity center movements. And also, we can see that this cost is negative. This means that when we get further from the road, the distance, the cost of movement is decreasing. And when we get closer to the road, so the distance is decreasing, the cost is, by the way, increasing. So we were first able to estimate this cost. But as I said before, we also had access to the location of the activity centers. So here is the location of two females in the Pyrenees. And we can map the distribution of probability of where the activity center can be the following year. And you can see on this map that the females living in the west could move across much larger areas than this female, which is more restricted here by the presence of a road. We have also access to population level estimates by summing all these distributions. And here you can see the probability of where each female could go the following year. And as you can see, the population seems to be restricted for the females in this core area. However, for the males, we found that they could move across a much larger area than the females, which align with what we know on the population and on the brown bear ecology. And if we sum up all this distribution for the males, you can see that males are able to move across much larger distance and could at some point link the two nuclei. And by the way, we are also able to provide the uncertainty maps. And here you can see that we are quite confident about these estimates. So to sum up for this chapter, I demonstrated that the major roads are restricting the home-range movement of brown bear between the years. So we were able to estimate the cost of the road at a larger scale. But one limitation that we encountered here is that we assume that the cost was the same throughout the life of an individual. And however, we know that the brown bear are usually dispersing when they are sub-adults. And in this case, we didn't account for that. So one perspective to improve this model would be to include age-specific cost value that enable an estimation of costs throughout the lives of the individual, enabling us to decipher if, when they are sub-adults, they are able to move across much larger areas. Finally, we can zoom out to the last chapter of my PhD to investigate another case study, which is the Eurasian links in the Jura. And especially, we want to answer the question, which is still kind of the same question: do the major roads are restricting the links recolonization? So why are we switching to another population? So a little bit of history on this population. So the Eurasian lynx is the third large carnivore present in France after the brown bear and the grey wolf. And the species disappeared in France in the 19th century. Following a reintroduction program in Switzerland in particular, the population is recolonizing France since 1974. And now the lynx is present in France in three populations. The Alpine population here in red, the Jura population here in blue, and the Vosges population here in yellow. And in this study, I mainly focused on the Jura population and on the data that we're collecting in France. And the challenge here that unlike the brown bear population, we do not have access to individual level data. We only have clues on when the species is present or not present. So when we detect the presence of lynx or when we detect not the presence of the lynx. And in France, the monitoring is carried out by the French Biodiversity Agency through the brown bear network. And we have access to this kind of non-invasive monitoring data. So here you can see on this map a grid that are covering our study area. It is 644 sites. And here the color depicts the number of months lynx were detected in these pixels. And we have access to data since 1999. And in this study, we subset our data set into three winters. The winter of 1999, 2009, and 2019 that are 10 years apart. To answer to the question to this question, we looked at the Jura scale with 2 decades of data, and we tried to understand to answer to the methodological question, which is can we bring another kind of distance, which is a commute time distance from circuit theory, because the least cost path distance in the movement model assumes that individual will follow the optimal path. And here in our case, we assume that individuals are recolonizing in France are not aware of the optimal path. So we wanted to use a commute time distance that is much more like the process we want to study. Therefore, because we have kind of different input data, we have a different model but the principle stays the same. So now imagine that we have sites where the links can be present or absent. If the site is occupied, we denote it by a 1, and when it's empty, we denote it by a 0. However, we do not have access to the true occupancy of each site. We only have access to the detection of the species throughout the year. And here, for instance, in a site that was occupied, we detected the presence of the lives 2 times over 3. However, in the site that was occupied, here we did not detect the presence of the links, and with what we have called the imperfect detection. And this kind of model are called the occupancy models because we are trying to understand the distribution of the populations. And like it's in spatial capture models, a site can be occupied and get instance, like an individual can die, for instance. So if we look at 2 occasions, so the first decade and the following decade, a site that was occupied then can get extinct, or the site that was empty can get colonized. And we want to account for the fact that a site which is closer to occupied sites is much more likely to be colonized than a site that is much further away from the colonized sites. And also, we wanted to account for the fact that if the landscape restricts the movement of links, it means that this site is much further away than this site where the individual doesn't really have to cross the road. And in the same way as before, we replace the Euclidean distance or the viscous path distance here by a commute time distance. And for instance, here, this site that was empty the first year get colonized 10 years later. And we can also estimate the cost as we did before. And here we have a negative cost, meaning that as we go further away from the road, the movement cost is decreasing. We can also provide the occupancy maps for the 3 winters. As you can see here, the cell in orange are the occupied cells, and the color is decreasing when the cell is not, as the occupancy probability decreases. And you can see on this map the recolonization of the links in the Pyrenees and how is it framed by the road that link Mulhouse to and we are also access to the uncertainty map. And as you can see here, the uncertainty is quite low, far away from the core of the population, because the model can assume that because this site is much further away from the rest of the population, it is unlikely that this site is being colonized between 10 years. And in this case, we only have access to population level maps because we only have access to population level data. So to sum up, here we have showed at another level that the primary roads are also restricting the recolonization of the links between decades. But we also have demonstrated that we are able to integrate other non-Euclidean distance into the hierarchical models, which is more aligned with the species ecology. And in fact, we could integrate any ecological distance as we think of, as long as they depict isolation or proximity between locations in the landscape. Finally, I would like to discuss the opportunities and the challenges of hierarchical models and when they are integrated with non-invasive monitoring. First, to answer to the question to which extent human infrastructure restrict large carnivore movement across scales, we consistently found a negative impact of human activities on large carnivore movements. However, beyond these ecological findings that align with what we already knew about these populations, we also have demonstrated methodological opportunities. On the top of the 3 challenges that hierarchical model address, I have also demonstrated in the first chapter that this model allows to make the most of the available monitoring by being able to integrate both systematic monitoring and opportunistic one. And there is also a growing body of research in spatial capture models that allows to integrate other movement models as well as GPS data to move in more in depth into movement processes. By showing that we are able to estimate the cost of movements, in my PhD, I have also demonstrated that we were able to do so for different groups in the population, enabling us to decipher differences within the population. And finally, because everything is estimated within the same model, this hierarchical model provides a uniform framework to include other ecological distance that depict distance and isolation between locations in the landscape. However, with this model, we also encountered methodological challenges. The first one is that this model are high computational demands. They take a long time to run, especially where they are applied on a large spatial scale and a long temporal scale, which is particularly impossible on a standard computer, but make still feasible with large clusters. However, sometimes it's still remaining impossible to apply this model at large spatial and temporal scales, which make us to develop technical tricks to make it feasible to run. The other limitation is that for now, this model only accommodates one cost variable, because we are only estimating one cost value for each landscape variable. And if we want to include other landscape variables to be more aligned with the species ecology, which is usually done in most connectivity analysis, we would have to estimate several cost values, which give some challenges, but there is a promising result on this part. Even though through this presentation, I mainly focused on large carnivore, this model can actually be applied in other species. And the fact is that the least cost path spatial capture models, as well as the least cost path occupancy model, was first applied on the American mink and on the leopard frog, two species which movement is impacted by the river network. And so this model can be applied to other populations, at least if 4 conditions are met. First, you need to have capture data or occupancy data on the population you are studying, as well as the landscape variable that you are assuming is impacting the movement of the species you are studying. Also, you need to have monitoring that enable you to detect your species or your individual at multiple locations to be able to have movement data into your data. And without this movement data, you can't really estimate the cost value. And then the last challenge is to have the spatial and temporal scale of your monitoring that match the spatial and the temporal scale of the process that you are studying. Because if you only have access to your data, for instance, you can't really have access to processes like recolonization processes. So to conclude, this model, while adaptable to different contexts, for studying how landscape is affecting movement, they are still initially tools to understand how the landscape is affecting species movements. And if we want to use them to make actionable predictions, we need still to be cautious, which means first to be able to accommodate multiple variables, as I said before, but also to be able to validate the output of the model to know if we are able to trust them. And therefore, the right balance between the complexity of the model and the structure will likely depend on the questions that you ask. As Mark Boswell and colleagues say in 2021, modeling is the art of making choices in a given context. And I really like this sentence because it highlights that modeling choices carries both strengths and limitation, and it's up to us as a team to define the right level of complexity for the task at hand. And overall, I believe that combining a hierarchical model with a non-Euclidean distance is opening up new opportunities for understanding the impact of humans' activities on wildlife movements, as well as, in some time, providing support for wildlife conservation. And with this final word, I would like to take this opportunity to thank first the member of the jury for going to evaluate my work here today. And also I want to thank all the people that made this PhD possible. I also want to thank all the collaborators that helped me throughout my PhD. I would also like to thank all the teams, and then I will switch to French. Je voudrais remercier les équipes et le réseau Loup Lynx et Ours Brun pour le suivi des populations et pour m'avoir aidé parmi cette thèse. Merci aussi aux collègues espagnols et andorrans pour permettre le suivi de ces populations. Je voudrais aussi dire un grand merci à mes 2 encadrants de thèse. Merci de m'avoir fait confiance jusqu'ici et de m'avoir donné tous ces conseils. J'aurais pas pu rêver d'une meilleure équipe, donc merci beaucoup, un grand merci pour ça. Un grand merci à l'équipe R, mais vous le savez déjà. Merci pour être aussi incroyable et bienveillant et d'être toujours d'une aide sans faille. Merci aussi à l'ensemble des membres permanents du CEF de rendre ce moment de thèse incroyable. Et en particulier, je voudrais aussi dire merci à mes collègues qui sont là aujourd'hui, à mes amis qui sont là, à ma famille, et en particulier merci à ma maman pour m'avoir toujours permis de suivre et encourager à suivre mes rêves. Merci beaucoup à tous.
On a l'impression que la soutenance est terminée, tout le monde s'en va.
Si, je vous entends bien, ça va?
Oui, là c'est bon, j'entends bien. Par contre, si personne ne parle, j'entends rien du tout.
Non, mais c'est normal pour l'instant, on attend les membres du jury. Angela,
Ok.
François, quand il parle, tu l'entends bien, là?
Eh ben, je t'entends beaucoup mieux, Olivier, que François.
Chacun les plus fort. On va demander à chaque membre du jury de parler très fort.
Très bien. Merci, désolé.
the microphone.
Okay.
So we are going to start the discussion now. So we are pleased to start with the last left.
Okay. Whoever's on the speaker, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I see. All right. So congratulations. I've really found it a pleasure to read your thesis, and also your presentation was outstanding. So I feel like you really have this wonderful gift at being able to explain kind of ecological statistics in a very easy to understand way, both in the written thesis as well as your presentation. So very, very, very good. So, appreciate that. So I just want to highlight a couple of the things that I really liked about your thesis, and then I'll get into asking you questions, because that's more important, like telling you how great I thought everything was. So a few things were just basically the whole thesis using the non-Euclidean distances and connectivity science. I just really appreciated the fact that it was structured around that. And despite all of the chapters being focused on methodological developments, I like that landscape ecology kind of framed the way that you viewed those processes and the different models to highlight both the spatial and the temporal dynamics. So that kind of ecological grounding I appreciated despite the statistical ecology focus. Also the multiple scales of analysis that you focused on, from the within home range movement to recolonization, using data both at the kind of individual and the species level. So I like that kind of multi-scale analysis. And then the focus on the hierarchical modeling and your ability to propagate that uncertainty and then show the uncertainty maps. I thought that was a really important contribution. And I think that should be really useful in terms of connectivity conservation and being used by decision makers in landscape planning. The commute time distance, I really like that integration into the spatial dynamic occupancy models. And then I thought that your new connectivity metric, the predicted connectivity, was really, really cool. And so, kind of looking at that probability of home range being occupied in subsequent years. So all of that I thought was excellent. And then the other thing is, I appreciated that each of your chapters had this, kind of simulation evaluating the effect of it. And so you're probably like an expert on simulation now. So really, really great work. So I just wanted to congratulate you and thought it was really a pleasure to read the thesis. So I'll start asking you questions now. So to start out, one question I just like to ask PhD students in general is to get a sense of what do you feel like, you did all of this body of work. What do you feel the most important lesson that you learned is from your time doing your PhD?
It's a great question. I think that the parts, like you highlight, when you have to simulate the data, is really an important part to be able to understand the model of what you are doing, if your assumptions are really aligned with what the results are. So I think that's it's something that I never did before, and I learned throughout my PhD is really about okay, you are able to model all these complicated things, but if you have this kind of data, you simulate it, are you able to retrieve these parameters and so on? So I think it's one thing that I've learned from my PhD, and yeah.
Great, thanks. So kind of a big picture kind of theoretical question maybe is, when we're thinking about landscape connectivity, you think about habitat suitability, kind of reflecting how the landscape can support the kind of needs or requirements of a particular organism that's living in a particular location, right? So just think about habitat suitability in general. But when we think about connectivity, we're most often thinking about movement through the landscape, right? So we're like not at a particular location, but this movement. The data that we use a lot of times is based on within home range scale movement, like your first chapter of your thesis, right? And oftentimes we conduct sampling when the population is like closed, so there's no dispersal happening. So we don't usually use dispersal data to quantify movement, yet we're concerned about movement through a landscape. So can you just reconcile that dilemma on, if we're using data that's reflecting movement within a home range to approximate connectivity as movement through a landscape? How do you use, like, is it appropriate to use that kind of home range scale level data to make inferences about connectivity, or just kind of talk through that with me? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's really something that it takes me time to try to understand, like, what kind of data do we have, what process are we interested in, and how both things are related. So cultural data, I mainly like to say we capture the individual at one location, so it was there at this time scale. And then connectivity, we are more interested in the process of movement. And by integrating the fact that individuals are detecting at multiple locations, and we have the order of where they go detecting, we have kind of what movements they are following. And we acknowledge for this kind of information that was not done before. And also, it made me think about the fact that we are using kind of underlying network to simulate and compute the distance. So we are looking at transition between a location in the landscape and how this transition are feasible. And yeah, it's not really answering to this question.
What would you, do we need to call it something different if we're using data from within a home range versus other types of data that are not within home range scale movements to approximate connectivity? Like, is it inappropriate, do you think, to use that? So we're talking about, within home range scale movements to talk about how connected a landscape is for a particular species, yet we're focusing on just a home range, for example, of an individual.
Yes, I think that, in fact, it's, if you look just at if individuals are how they are using the landscape, and you want to put like larger scale management plan, for instance, it's not really the same processes that we are interested in. So if you're just looking at 1 year space use and you want to look at dispersal processes, it's not kind of the same of movement. But with where the individual is 1 year, like the two processes, it's something that it took a long time to me to understand, because I think that these two processes happens quite at the same time, because individuals disperse within 1 year, but they also some other individual in the population is using the landscape within this 1 year. So it depends also if the individual is kind of dispersing, or if it's just territorial species which is not moving much. This is why I think that looking at the individual heterogeneity, which is we can live between groups or between the age classes, might be something that could be interesting. And so I think we can use the home range data to look at home range level, and if we want to look at larger landscape connectivity scale, I think that we need to have more than 1 year of data to be able to identify this a few individuals in the population that really connect the landscapes and connect population, which is usually a more rare event than most of the population doesn't know.
I have a related question to follow up on that. It's something that came to me when you talked about your perspectives at the end. You said that when you talked about dispersal, and I was wondering if really this market capture data, you can get to that level, because in most mammal species, at least, dispersal is a very rare event. It happens maybe once in the lifetime. So, do you think it's possible to get that event with capture market capture data?
I think that most of the time, no. But in the case of a large carnivore, when there is a really intense monitoring with a lot of benevolent which collect the data, for the case of the Pyrenean brown bear population, we almost know all the individuals in the population. So we have a lot of data of this population. So in this case, I think we will be able to look at dispersal events. That is like just 1 year for one individual. So it's really, really a rare event. So in this case, I think that with capture data, we could be able to quantify the connectivity and dispersal process. But most of the time, I think that it could be not possible, not feasible, I think.
I'm going to switch to your chapter when you were looking at the individual heterogeneity. And so you found that it was important to model that individual heterogeneity, and I like the resistance parameter for the sections and that, being able to do that group specifically. In that chapter, you recommended removing these outlier individuals when your goal is to estimate population size, but then to keep it in there when you're thinking about connectivity. Do you have some kind of guidance to researchers who are looking at their movement data, and how do you identify an outlier? How would you recognize when you should or should not remove these kind of long distance or frequently recaptured individuals? What kind of guidance would you tell people? What's an outlier in that case?
I think that in this case, we really need to look at what the data looks like and what the mean distance, average mean distance. It's something usually people compute when you look at to which extent individuals are captured. So you can see in this case, if you have just 1 or 2 individuals with a specific space use, which is really different from the rest of the population. I think you can do both analysis, like doing, for instance, even though the goal is to estimate population size and like, oh, try to remove this outlier or not, you can do both analysis by keeping all the data and doing the same analysis when you remove the 2 individuals that for you seems to have distance between detection that is really, really different from the rest of the population. And also if you have clues like the brown bear, it's usually see that there is some individuals that doesn't seem to have the same capture history of captures than the rest of the population. And you can see if in the 2 analysis, the estimation you get is quite close, or if it's really different. We can give you some clues first to know if you need to remove them or no. Because if you keep them and the estimate are the same, then you should keep all the individuals in the population. I think it's one answer. And I think, yes, looking at what the data looks like, how many recaptures do you have per individual, what's the distance between the recaptures, if how the sampling design align with the kind of data that you get. I think it's the first step to go through before trying to implement these models.
Yeah, I bring it up just because some of your thesis is about landscape structure influencing movement, and there may be some underlying landscape structure that's causing those individuals to, from your view, be outliers. It might be responding to something on the landscape that's right causing that.
Maybe there is a corridor, and
that might be actually important.
So definitely when the goal is to look at movements, you need to keep all individual and try to understand what causes these processes and what is causing this data you are looking at. But when the goal is population size, from what we know, the spatial capture model are quite robust to misspecification. So
do you think there's any situations where ignoring individual heterogeneity is okay?
I think,
And like not to model the sex-specific parameters?
for the connectivity parameters, I think that it's important to include it in the model if there is a landscape variable that strongly impacts your movement. And if the objective is, for instance, to look at population size, because from what we saw of the simulation, if the landscape is not restricting much the movement, keeping the Euclidean model is okay. We don't have bias estimates, so we could have this parameter, this connectivity parameter included just if there is a landscape strongly impacted the movement, or if it's a goal of the study. And I think the most important part when we need to include individual heterogeneity is on the scale parameter, where I didn't talk at all in this presentation, but it's when it's depict how far from its activity center an individual can be detected. And I think in this part of the model, it's much more important to model individual heterogeneity compared to the cost parameter. Thanks.
Do you think that there's any utility in thinking about like when you're thinking about the individual heterogeneity, about your latent groups being related to something other than sex? Like if you were to, you said that you did another analysis that you didn't present, right, in your thesis. Have you thought about what some non-sex specific groups might be and what kind of hypotheses you might have that would be driving individual heterogeneity that might be useful to try to model some group specific?
At some point, we discussed with, we were thinking of maybe there are behavioral differences, like a bold individual and more shy individuals that might cause these differences. For females, there might be when they have cups, they seem to have a smaller arm range than when they don't have, and we might not be able to detect the cups. So maybe at some point we detect a smaller arm range, but because individuals have cups, or because with different behavioral differences that may be the same throughout their life or change throughout also their life. So there may be a lot of ecological underlying processes that might affect.
I'm just curious, did you have data on age of the individual? So could you use the mixture model to probabilistically assign, like, assuming you tell it you don't know anything about the age of them, are you able to probabilistically assign the kind of age groups? Did you try that?
We tried it. Our third objective was to use the mixture model.
Yeah.
And during the simulation study, we encountered challenges and we were not able to identify all parameters. So at some points we just say, so it's not worth it. And also because we have assumption of there is sex differences, and because from the data, it was quite clear that just some individuals were different from the rest of the population. So we move through so in our brown bear case, we know the group, so we were not going to try the mixture model. But, and for the age, yes, we have the age of all, for the brown bear, we have the age of all individuals in the population, most of them. And because there is so intensive monitoring of the population. And I don't know if the mixture model would, if it worked, would have find this age group. But I think that because we have this data on age, we could include it directly in the model and estimate.
Yeah, I was just wondering, like, if you didn't have that, if your mixture model would have worked.
Even in this case, with two individuals having really different space use that we are we know of, and we just don't say it to the model, and we ask to try to estimate something, it don't work.
Yeah, okay.
So yeah.
In the commute time distance model, how did you decide on the number of nodes that you were using for the spatial graph for the resistance surface? And do you think that that decision is sensitive? You know, is that a, you know, whether you use 8 or 16 nodes, does that make a difference? Did you like look at that sensitivity to the number of nodes? Like, does it change your results in terms of the estimates?
I didn't. Something that I realized after I did all the analysis, to be true, and I think that yes, that changing the number of edges would change maybe change the results, especially because in the commute time distance, if there is too many paths possible, the model just don't have some issue to converge. So we have also need to find a right balance between the compute time and what we want to estimate. And I also think that the number of edges is quite important, but also the resolution of the resistance surface. If at which scale do we think that the movement will be able to model the transition between locations? So we try to make the most fine resolution as possible, but we don't really. I think it would be something really interesting to look at the sensitivity to all this.
Is there some kind of like scalar issue that you can explore there? Like, is there an optimal balance that you think, like, how would you go about figuring that out?
I think we should conduct a simulation study to look at if we simulate the data with 4 edges, and then we try to estimate parameters with the 16 edges, would it be the same result, or do we have different estimates? I think that it's something that should be done now. Okay. At the end of all these processes, I came to yes, but I have to be able to conduct all the analysis. At some point, I have to make the choices. And the right thing is that I kept 8 because it's not 4, it's not 16. I said, okay, I will take 8 because it's average. And then in most of the in the Oscar package, they use 8. So I said, okay, I will use 8, and after that, I didn't change. But I think it's something that we should look more deeply.
Am I done? I can ask her plenty of questions. So we can move on.
That's the last one.
The last one.
Oh, okay. So thinking about multi-species connectivity modeling. So it seems like relatively easy to focus on one species. How would you think about, thinking about like a connectivity design where you're estimating resistance values for multiple species and coming up with a kind of landscape plan or connectivity model for a large landscape when it's not just one species? Like, how would you actually go about doing that? Like, how would you model that and then present it to a decision maker?
I think that first we need to be sure that we have monitoring data that enable us to look for species with different movement extents if we're able to estimate cost value for each species. Because for large carnivore, we have the data set, but if we are maybe looking at, I don't know, ungulate population, for instance, maybe they're smaller movement extents, and maybe we should have data like maybe a clustered design, or being able to have smaller recapture for this species. Also, if we go for multi-species, there is like a recent paper that say that they try to, instead of estimating for multiple species, they try to make functional groups of species with the same kind of movement abilities to look at connectivity for each functional groups. But it's a really...
But like in practice, how would you do this? Would you create multiple resistance layers? Would you create multiple connectivity maps and try to identify areas that like stack up to get like,
Yeah.
how would you do it?
I think that the easier way to go first would be just to conduct multiple analyses for each species, having a connectivity map for each species, and look if there is areas that match and are important for multiple group of species, and combining with the uncertainty map. But I think if we go to a manager and we show 100 of maps with 100 of uncertainty maps, I will just say, it's too much information, how should I do? But it's really, yeah, I think, yes, conducting multiple analysis is a first step, and being able to look at resistance for each species first.
Thank you. I propose to move to Céline.
Merci. Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank Maëlis and Olivier for your invitation, and apologize again for my absence today. I really enjoyed reading your thesis. It is very well written. You are able to explain it very pedagogically. That's a great quality of researcher and teacher also, and I congratulate you on it. And your oral presentation is of the same quality, very pedagogically. It completes your manuscript very, very well and answers some of the questions asked in the reports, especially on the definition of the landscape resistance, for instance. And in your thesis, I found that in each article you took a step back and put your results into perspective. So it is very easy to see the logical progression between the different parts. But I was a little frustrated by the discussion in your thesis, which touched on many points very quickly, without going into detail. So I would like to ask you some questions. For instance, in your discussion, you talk about the combination of hierarchical models and network models. And could you describe in a little more detail how this combination could be achieved, and for what uses, what are the complementarities between models?
Yeah, maybe what I wanted to say is that, in fact, in hierarchical models, it's a network that is embedded into it. When you have, for instance, for instance, the occupancy model, you have the centroid of each site in your landscape, and you use the ecological distance to compute the distance between sites. So you have a regular grid, which in fact is a network. And I think it's by acknowledging that it is a network, that it is embedded inside the model, we can look at the importance of edges and bring all the concepts that are already developed in network theory to look at the importance of some edges in the landscape, because here we mainly use a regular grid, but we can think of a case when we have ponds, for example, which are not regularly placed. And here it's in fact a network. And it's just that hierarchical model is embedding a network inside a hierarchical framework when you estimate uncertainty and you estimate imperfect detection. So it's what I wanted to say. I don't know if it's clear.
And do you think that it is possible to integrate population dynamics and individual-centered modeling into landscape graphs that would be used in graph theory?
I think, yes, that you could, in part of the model, simulate from an individual-based model, individuals moving through the landscape, and having, for instance, a number of individuals reaching some path, as an explicit measure of distance between patches. So it means that yes, we could include an individual-based model, and like if we had a lot of data and it would be we could do everything. I think we could even though estimate the values of the individual-based model in the model, because we integrate everything to a single framework.
Okay, thank you. And I had the same question as Angela about the generalization of other species and multiple species. So I changed my question, and I focusing on just one species, the otter, in your thesis. Unlike the other two species, the otter has a composite habitat combining aquatic and terrestrial environments. And I'm wondering, how can hierarchical models account for this heterogeneity in habitats? Do you integrate the difference between the two types of habitats?
In our model, we use a distance to the river network as a cost layer to model the movement of otter, but it was really difficult to estimate this cost, because individuals don't really go much far away from the river network, and the monitoring is also on the river network most of the time. So we don't really have data of individuals that are moving from one river. They cross the land and they go on another river, so we don't have much information on that. But we could use a simpler model that just assume that that otters are only in the river, and that's what Olivier did recently. That instead of estimating the cost, we just put in the model a river network when individual can move. This means that you don't have a 2D movement space, but you can only move through the network. So it would be one case when you just remove the land in your space, and you enable only transition throughout the river. So just by removing all the pixels that are on the land, and all the transitions that are from a river to land, for instance. So we could do something like that.
Okay. Very interesting. Thank you. The three species that you studied are highly mobile species for which regular monitoring is available. So would the models you have developed be suitable for species with smaller movement abilities and or less regular monitoring?
I think we reach with this complex model a limit where we need a lot of data to be able to estimate all the parameters. So you have to have a monitoring that is suited for the species that you are monitoring. But if you want to look at a species with much smaller movements, you also need to have a monitoring that is much finer. And when you could detect also a movement at a much more final scale. And if you don't really have a lot of data, and especially a recapture of the same species of the same individual at multiple locations, I think you will not be able to identify the parameter of the model. I think they rely on a lot of data.
And I have another question, but a more general question about the contribution of local stakeholders in your work. Were they involved in the definition of the research questions, the construction of the models, or the interpretation of the results? What are the relationships with them?
we started, I received studying during my Master 2 degree. When the first objective was because the current monitoring of the population of the brown bear is detecting most of the individual, but as the population is growing, more and more individuals are missed every year. So since a few years, there is a capture model that enables to estimate population size, but without to have an estimation of population size where the individuals are missed. And the objective of this first master degree, of my master degree, was to be able to implement a spatial capture model on this population. So it was a joint work with the brown bear team. So I spent a lot of time discussing with Jérôme about the monitoring of the population, about what might impact the detection probability. This is mainly the aim of the first chapter of my PhD, when we looked at modeling how each different part of the monitoring might impact the detection probability of the brown bear. And then at the end, they began to have also questions on the connectivity of the population, but from my side, I didn't really know what connectivity was, and that it was used in several disciplines, from genetic exchange and space use, so you can use this term in different contexts. So we try to estimate, to use the model with this non-Euclidean model. So it's when I first use this model. And then for my PhD, I'm much more went into the modeling parts and to be able to develop new tools, but still by being in contact with the brown bear team and with the wolf lynx team. But my thesis at the end went really into methodological development. So we are a step before being able to apply this model for real case questions. We mainly answer to questions from which we already have the answer, just to be able to know if the model we were developing were able to retrieve the same answer as with other methods. So at the end, we discussed a lot, but because it was mainly methodological development, it was not on a day-to-day basis. But for example, when I showed them the map with a high density of brown bear in the Parc National d'Ordesa and Montfermeil, they were like, "What is your model? It's completely false. There is no bear there. We know that." I said, "Yes, but I didn't say that to my model, so it can't know that there is no individual there." And with this discussion, I figured out that what were the limitations and what could be the possible improvement in the model. It's a long answer, but yeah, there was discussion, but because my thesis was mainly methodological, it was just it was not really trying to answer to real case management question. But I think that at some point we could go in this way.
Yeah, but it's a very important point, because we develop models to be used in the field for stakeholders and managers. And I'm wondering, in the same ideas, if the models could be relevant for predicting the conflicts between bear and sheep breeders, like we perform models for wolf, for example. And in this case, models will be relevant.
I think in this case, so we have access to the distribution of the population. I think that for this point we really missed the distribution of livestock to be able to match precisely these two maps, to be able to find the area where there is a high density of livestock and high density of bear, when the risk of depredation could be higher. But it could be something that could be a product of this spatial capture model. And yeah,
And we don't have data about the location of.
Concerning that particular point, I was a little surprised to see that they didn't consider the paper by Gastino in 2019. It was trying to cope with high risk and cold risk in terms of spatial structure and availability of livestock and birds. So is it much your kind of modeling or?
I think that our study is mainly focused on France.
Yeah.
And the challenge here that we wanted to integrate both detection in Spain and detection in France, and we didn't have access to both kind of high resolution for both countries. So
yeah, but at least in terms of methodology, could have discussed perhaps, or was it so different that because you didn't have the Spanish data, even discussing about the concept of kind of method that was used that was not relevant?
I'm not sure that I'm remembering really deeply what the method was, and it wasn't really about looking at the depredation risk and so on. It wasn't more that when looking at the data, we saw that there are many recapture of bears through this monitoring. So we went through a way of how we could manage to easily integrate this kind of data in the model, but multiple recapture of bears, rather than understanding depredation risk. But maybe if we want to answer this question, this could be some way we could do it.
Thank you. Sorry, please go on.
Yeah. I have a last question and your conclusion. I really liked the conclusion about the trade-off between model complexity and realism. And I would have liked you to discuss these questions a little more because there is my question also. How far should we go in terms of complexity? Bearing in mind that this can come at a high cost, as you said, in terms of time, skills, and money, of course. And are the most realistic models necessarily the most relevant for decision making? What are your opinions about this point?
It was really more an open question that's why my PhD developing complex model, and I just asked myself like what I am doing, is it relevant? Is it this model at some point is useful for someone? Because we are at the point of developing this model that we can't really use them for predict and for management decision for now. And with the time, I came to realize that it's just one step, and at some point we will be able to have models that can include a different part of the model. And it's also that I realize the fact that I came to realize from my PhD that and to understand by reading different papers that I think you can't understand to a process that only using one model. I think that using different models that make different assumptions, you can came to realize what the process is. So there is no perfect model for questions, and so there is no shame to have to say that my model is not perfect, it's not a control that. But it was just more an open question that I wanted to add to my PhD, because as someone developing models, I was wondering about what is model complexity, and should we develop even more complex model that maybe at some time we not really understand what is happening. But as we are constructing models by adding different kind of bricks, I think it's how I see modeling is just like for now we were using mainly Euclidean distance because it was the easiest, but there is other kind of non-Euclidean distance that can help us to answer to other questions, whether is it for understanding processes or for making predictions. So I don't really have like answer for that. It's just that's at the end of my PhD, I just wanted to acknowledge that it's something that I have in mind throughout my PhD.
Okay, thank you. I have no more questions, so congratulations again for the quality of your work and the quality of your answers and very interesting discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Céline. So we need to Richard. Okay, yes, thank you very much. Yeah, I agree with Angela saying that this was a really nice thesis to read, really thorough and well explained. You're also a really good communicator. Your presentation was excellent. It was easy to understand and fun for those of us that work with some of this stuff. It's really fun to see this from a perspective like that. So I really appreciated that. I met you in Norway already, and it's kind of also very nice to see you in your sort of natural habitat now, finally. So thanks for having me here. Yes, so one of the things that I've been pondering for a while and also came to mind when I read your thesis and heard your talk is that we as ecologists, and often we have a bit of a conservation focus, management focus. Your thesis is also quite applied. There's very applied questions behind it. There's people out there waiting for answers to the things that you came up with, to the maps and so on, right? And questioning what you're doing. And one thing that I was curious about is, you know, we're often end up measuring behavioral responses, and often we end up measuring behavioral responses one way or another, whether that's distance these animals are willing or able to move, whether the areas they're able to occupy or move into, whether it's when they're active, all these things, these are all behavioral responses. And we measure them and then we often try to relate them to the stuff we're doing, humans, right? Because that's the world we live in, that's the thing we're interested in, that's what it's often about right now. And then I'm wondering, so these animals are responding and we're saying, oh, well, there's a problem here. They're doing something. They're responding. You know, they're responding to these roads. They're responding to these altered landscapes that they're living in now. And then you're asking yourself, well, okay, should I be concerned about the ones that are responding? Or should I be concerned about the ones that are not responding, right? Because what would you do if you would have come into this situation and you go out there and say, well, it looks like these bears just move around freely, regardless of the fact that there's roads out there, for example, right? And so obviously I'm asking about the fact, are we looking at this and saying this is actually an adaptive response, which could actually be positive. It may enable them to live in these environments and sort of go about their business and persist in there. And of course, on the other side, it is a response. We know it might have an impact on what's happening in these populations. So I wanted you to maybe reflect on that aspect of it a little bit. And also, as you're answering this, maybe you also take it a step further and not just answer the proximate questions. Okay, there's an impact on connectivity. There's an impact on movement. Well, what's coming after that? Like, what's the other stuff that's actually being affected? There's more ultimate effects. You mentioned this, of course, a bit in your presentation, but maybe go to that point. So it's a big question, but give it a shot.
What if, for instance, there wasn't any effects, and we saw that the brown bear moves freely through the landscape? Maybe we could have maybe sometimes the models that we are designing isn't relevant for like we are looking at impact of movement, and maybe for this individual they can move freely through the landscape, but the mortality risk is higher when they cross the road, and maybe we can detect them freely, and sometimes the individual just disappear because it gets hit on the road. And here, maybe just because the model is not answering to the right questions, maybe we should more be concerned about demographic parameters and how the movement structures might impact other demographic parameters. Because if we want to go to the point that what we ultimately want is that the population lives and don't get extinct. It's most of the time what the objective. Maybe the fact that the home range is different, just maybe because the habitat is quite nice there, and they don't have to move a large distance to find food, for instance. So maybe we can detect a response in our model without an effect, really effect. Maybe not the effect of the road that is important, but maybe there is enough food, and therefore they don't have to cross the road to find food, or So I think it's by combining different knowledge and different approach to different questions that we can fully understand what might impact the population, and at the end, if the population can survive or not. So yeah, I think that detecting or not a response throughout the model is just one clue about the process, but we need to develop and to try with throughout different angles to see if maybe detecting this kind of response is maybe not linked to some other confounded factors. I'm also thinking about density dependence in this area, because we get a point that there is a high number of bear in this area, and we don't know if maybe it's not a problem, maybe it's totally fine, but it's something also we can look at. So I think that with this model, we are just trying to answer to one angle of what the percent of the population might be, and it's only by multiplying the angles that we could at some point understand fully and make reliable answers.
Yeah, I think I like that answer, and you sort of alluded to one aspect here, that's fitness, because you mentioned the one part of it, which is survival, and one could look at this and say, well, yes, they're being curtailed, their movements are being curtailed by these roads and by this infrastructure, but that's better than the alternative, which is being run over, right, by cars. And so this next perspective, so this sort of maybe this next step, and I'm maybe going to say about this, is it possible for us to maybe take one look at these fitness effects or genetics? You mentioned genetics, that we're talking population genetics. Would there be some way for us to look at that already at this point? I know we don't want to make these models more complex. I realize they're already complex enough. You're already having computational issues, but we're always going to be greedy, right, as ecologists and as ecological modelers. So could you see that there may be some promise and maybe something we can gain by taking that next step and saying, okay, well, what's the actual fitness consequences? Can we measure them? Can we integrate that? Can we assess these?
Yeah, and maybe this model is just trying to highlight that maybe there is a problem with road, but only looking at is the effective population size is large enough, and this is just throughout population genetic analysis that we could be able to answer to this kind of question. So maybe just this model is highlighting maybe there is a problem there, or maybe there is not, and it's throughout other analysis that we could be able to look at these processes and fitness and so on.
So then I'll change the tack a little bit here, and one thing that I thought was really nice, of many things that were really nice in this thesis, is that you provided these uncertainty maps, and Angela also said, this is something really important. A lot of people don't do this, and it's really important, because otherwise you just have a map. There's cool stuff going on, lots of colors, but you need to know which part you should pay more attention to and which parts maybe less attention. And so there, I was wondering, can you think of a way, because there's still two maps, right? And it's okay to do that, but could you think of a graphical way to combine these two? Would there be some way, maybe you've tried this, but you can show these connectivity, the level of connectivity that's there, or the cost path, or whatever it is that you're measuring? Could you show that in one map and at the same time display the degree of certainty or reliability in that particular location on the map? Could you think of some way of doing that?
I thought of trying to make like 3D maps when we could have in the pixel there was a value and the uncertainty associated with it, but it was not really understandable. We just like too much information in one part. So I believe that making two maps is better, because you can look at, this part is quite interesting, and then look at the uncertainty, and by combining the two, it's giving you clues. But I also think that this uncertainty maps is not, you're just looking at the uncertainty at one pixel, but there is like a lot of level of uncertainty that are combined, because we have uncertainty of the location of the activity center, we have uncertainty of the size of the scale parameter, we have uncertainty of the estimated costs. There's a lot of uncertainty that are combined there. So I think that these uncertainty maps are nice, but I wonder if they are still enough, or if we should do something else. But I don't have. It was the best that came to my mind, but I don't know if there is other way to present it that fully represents the uncertainty. Yeah, I don't know.
That's probably very ambitious to do it fully, but I mean, I think this sort of 3D approach, at least we're trying. We tried this too, and I agree it's super busy. You know, one option would be to just show multiple sort of samples from your posterior, right? Just actually give people a series of maps. Like, these are all possible outcomes. These are all alternative outcomes, and you pick enough of a range that people can maybe visually appreciate the variation and the uncertainty there. Okay, I have one last question, if there's time for that still. Yes, okay. And that concerns this neat trick of having multiple observation processes and include them in the same model, right? Like you did with the bears, where you had your hair sample collections combined with the camera trapping, and you used the sheep as your traps, basically, right? It was the areas of sheep and then as your traps, and collected even more DNA and identified individuals. And the reason this kind of works is because you make the assumption that the underlying ecological process is the same. And so my question here is a little bit twofold. One of them is, can you really separate this observation process and the ecological process, especially with spatial capture and recapture? And the second question is, can you see cases where this assumption could be wrong, where the way you look at the process, depending on the method, actually changes this process and maybe violates this assumption that things are the same as you look at them?
First question, I don't really see what you want to, like, separating also the...
Maybe just identify for us the ecological process clearly. These are the ecological components, these are the observation components.
For this part, it made me think that for the opportunistic data, for instance, the sheep are mainly into open areas where they grow, and the camera traps and the earth-like are mainly in forested area because there are trees there and they grab their back there, and so we couldn't, that there was two kind of space use that was different, because sometimes they were in the forest, sometimes they were in open areas. It changed also during the year. So we wondered to which extent it was right to be able to combine these two type of data. But at the end, we thought that because we are integrating all the year-long space use, it might be okay. But if we wanted to look at more fine-scale processes and space use processes that could change throughout the year, with the bear following the food resources throughout the year, maybe it could not be okay to combine these two types of data. And yes, that's my answer.
We can talk about this later as well. So I think I want to give the others also a chance to ask their questions. So thank you very much. I'm really okay. I think I got the answers. I was looking for the rest we'll discuss.
Okay.
Thank you for making it to this jury. It was very interesting to me to read your thesis, and I really appreciated it. I learned a lot on the spatial capture models, because I come from the connectivity side, but really not from the spatial recapture side. So it was super useful for me to read your thesis. I learned a lot. And I really appreciated also, as we said before, your presentation, your oral presentation. I was really impressed by how easily you could make your complicated methods and concepts go through the audience. So congratulations for that. I also appreciated, I was saying before, accounting for uncertainty, adding this aspect of uncertainty in connectivity modeling. It's true that it's something that we rarely have in connectivity studies. Just one little thing that I missed in the introduction, so on this I disagree a bit with Angela, is that I missed a bit some biological aspects on the mechanisms behind the concepts that you explained, for example, the different types of movements. It arrived later in the thesis, but in the introduction it was a bit missing, just to find something. So first, a very general question. When I read your thesis, it gave me the impression that really the capture-recapture approach on non-invasive sampling was potentially super powerful to estimate connectivity. And it gave me then the feeling that maybe it was the way to follow and to forget about genetics, forget about GPS. So I'm wrong, it's because I don't know very well those rules, but can you, maybe it will make you go a bit again on what you already said before, but could you make us a synthesis of what are the limits, because I'm sure there are limits of this approach to estimate connectivity and to infer things about connectivity?
I think that the main limitation comes from the data. We are in case with large carnivore, and we have extensive data sets over multiple years. There is really an intensive monitoring with a lot of people involved in it to collect huge amount of data. So this is when in this case this model works quite well. So it's a case when it's fine. So I think that the limits is to have enough data to be able to apply this model, to have a monitoring that is at the scale of the process that you are studying. That if you want to look at long-term distance movement, you need to have a monitoring that could capture all the steps throughout this movement. So this is also a limit. The computation time is also at the time we are now quite a huge limit, because for the PhD it was kind of okay. It takes like a week to run on computer, so it was still quite feasible. But if we have to imagine to run a model for France, for instance, it could really become difficult to run. And also we add to I said into the PhD, but not really in the presentation, that for now we are pre-calculating all the possible distance for a range of resistance value, because it makes it faster. And we come to manage to integrate the distance computation within the model to remove this aspect of pre-calculating all the distance, which will at some point allow us to integrate multiple landscape variables. But for now, we are only able to integrate one, maybe two, but it's mainly connectivity analysis. We are able to integrate like 10 or more landscape variable at timescale resolutions. So so there is still some limitation of improving the computation time. And I think that it's mainly only like informaticians with deep knowledge on how to make things run faster that could allow us to run something. So I think there's the computation, the number of landscape variable and the data are quite the main limitation.
I was wondering also, I don't think I saw, so when you do modeling, and when you do connectivity modeling, at some point you want to test the validity of the predictions. I don't think I saw that in your work. Did you think about doing that, and did you miss data to be able to do that?
Yes, it was mainly the case, because we would want to have access, for instance, to GPS data to be able to validate the model. And for the brown bear population, the only bear for which we have access to GPS data are the translocated one. And we know that for the first year after their translocation, their movement patterns is quite different from the bears that are living for some times in the Pyrenees. So we didn't wanted to validate our model with this data that is for a period of life of these individuals after that translocation. So we didn't really have the data to be able to validate this model. But I think that if we want to reach a point that we want to make prediction, it will become a really important step. But yeah, I didn't have time also to do it during my PhD.
Okay. In the conclusion of your first paper, the first paper of the thesis, you said that the maps of realized connectivity allow to provide spatial information to practitioners to, for example, locate wildlife crossing messages. But the resolution, if I'm not wrong, the resolution of your maps is 5 kilometers.
Mm.
So do you think it could work?
Yeah.
How would that be possible?
And thinking back to what I wrote in it, I think that yes, maybe it gives us information of the area where it could be interesting to look more deeply in and to run much more local model on some area of the landscape, maybe at much finer resolution. But yeah, maybe the scale at which we are doing the analysis doesn't really allow us to be able to look at fine scale. Yes, you should be here and not 10 meters away. Yes, I agree.
Okay. In the second paper, so in the simulation part, you gave the simulation results in terms of the percentage of simulation for which population size was underestimated. And in what I read, it seemed that you assume that it is better to underestimate rather than to overestimate population size. And I was wondering why it was better one than the other. And also, I was wondering why the size of the confidence interval wouldn't be, whether it would be better to focus on that, whether it was below or above population size.
I don't think that yeah, it's better to under or overestimate. Like being biased is not really great. But yes, I think we also need to have a trade-off between not being biased and being precise enough to be able to have reliable estimates. So yeah, maybe I should add a part of looking at both bias and the trade-off with the confidence interval to be small enough.
In the sub-chapter, again, in the simulation part of the chapter, I think, if I understood well, you set so you had 3 scenarios of the variable effect of resistance, I think, on movements, or the variable effect of landscape on movements. But you set the movements as equal in the 3 scenarios, and I was wondering why you made that choice. Because so in your scenario, if I understood well, even if in one scenario the impact of, for example, roads is more important than in another one, the distance crossed by individuals is the same, remains the same. Whereas we can assume that in the real life, if the resistance of a feature is larger, then they will cross a lower distance. So why did you make that choice?
We made this choice because when we are increasing resistance, it's in the model decreasing the spacious extent of the individuals. And because we wanted to acknowledge that we want and also because when the spacious extent they get just less detected by the traps, we get worse estimates just because not because when the connectivity, the resistance is too high, we don't manage to estimate the values, but because when in the simulation you set the resistance and the cost value of movement is too high, we have not enough detection of the individual by our monitoring. So we should have like the smaller traps. So we wanted to keep the spacious extent the same, but having the shape of the movements which is more or less impacted by the landscape. which means that the orange side is equals in all our simulations, which lets that we could use the same trapping grid for all the simulation. We have the same kind of data, the same number of detection per individual, but just we wanted to be sure that the only parameter that was varying was the resistance of landscape for the simulation, to look if we were able to estimate this parameter when all the parameters in the model was equals. So this is why we wanted to, in the simulation, just to see if we were able to estimate this cost parameter, having the same space use throughout because quickly we just stopped detecting the individual, so we couldn't estimate anything. So we made a mistake the first time, and I made a visit to Chris Sutherland in St. Andrews, and we discussed about that, and something they encountered before in the simulation, and the answer they gave is to set the space use constant throughout the simulation, just to be able to have everything constant and just to extend.
Then, so about your cost or resistance estimates coming from your analysis. So you get estimates going from -5 to 5, right? And I try to relate those values, those ranges of values, to the cost estimates that we usually have in, when we make resistance maps. Usually it's very classic, it goes from 0 to 100. And in several studies, it was shown that it is important to have a large variation, a large range of variation in those values, so that you can, when you model the connectivity, you can really see the effect of the landscape of the movements. So I was a bit surprised that your range of values was very restricted, and that it was going from negative to positive. And so can you tell us how your range of values relate to the more classical ranges of values that we use in connectivity studies?
Here, this resistance value is not directly the resistance estimate that is in each pixel. It is like an exponential regression. You have a parameter that's estimated by the model that multiply the landscape variable that you put as input in the model, and you take an average of this value. So because we can see it as a regression coefficient of your landscape, and in this kind of regression, usually we center and reduce our landscape to be able to not have too much differences between different cells in the landscape. So it's why we had a much lower cost estimates. However, sometimes with just a variation of 1 to 1.1, the resistance values sometimes get really high, especially when we use the road density. We had Toulouse in the study area, which are really high density compared to all the rest of the landscape. It gave us some issues. So I'm not sure that this cost parameter can relate directly to what is usually used. And why is it sometimes positive, sometimes negative? It's again because it's a regression coefficient of the landscape. We want to allow for the landscape to sometimes facilitate movements and sometimes impede movements. And simply by having these estimates, we can know if the landscape that we put in our model is facilitating or impeding movements without previous knowledge.
Can I just ask a question that's somewhat related, not focused on the resistance parameter, but on the resistance surface itself? You mentioned that you need to have some knowledge of what might be facilitating movement or resisting movement. If you don't have information, say someone's interested in connectivity and you want to be able to estimate connectivity, yet you have no idea where to start. Do you think there's utility for using machine learning to come up with resistance services, and what might be some pitfalls of doing that?
I'm not sure. I think what's this gonna mean, but in machine learning, you don't really know the coefficients of the model, and what we are interested in is to understand what the process is and what is this cost value. Is it if you have no previous knowledge of the landscape and you can say, yeah, I don't know if maybe the road can facilitate movement because the bear are using the path in the forest to go from one location to another, or maybe it is restricting because there is human there and that they avoid if we have access to really fine scale data. We could use this model to be able to know if is the bear avoiding this path or are they using them. But I'm not sure where machine learning could help to do that. But maybe it's something. I don't know.
Okay, I have one last question, which is more like a curiosity question. You said in your discussion that you initiated a simulation study to test whether the current sampling design recommended for CMR occupancy data is still valid when what you want to do is connectivity modeling. So, what do you have the results?
Where is my? Yeah. I think I stopped to share the screen. So can we go back to Zoom, share the screen? So I didn't present it into my PhD because it was not the final results, and it was just too preliminary, so I didn't want to take time to include it in the model. But it's something that I wanted to do just right at the beginning of my PhD. It was there is several guidelines to apply to have a sampling design to be able to retrieve the estimates which relate to the trap spacing and to the size of the buffer around your sampling design. And we had this idea that maybe to be able to estimate this cost value, we should have more traps than what is usually recommended to have estimates of population size. So we get to have three kind of landscape. One patchy landscape, one landscape that might depict the distance to some barrier, and some binary landscape. And we came to have a different sampling design. So we thought of a lot of sampling design. So here are some when we think curve. We are varying on the first line. It's when we have the same area is sampled, but we just are increasing the number of traps, and they get more and more and more closer, and we try to find the optimum of trap spacing here. And usually what people say is it's around 2 sigma, which is sigma representing the size of the home range. And we also try other design. The 3231 is lace work that was presented by Murray effort. They say that you have some traps that are quite close to each other, and then you have also a area with less traps, so you can detect small movement as well as broader movements. We think of stratified designs by having maybe traps in area facilitating movement and area restricting movement, for instance. And we looked at the final design with it, which was paired traps. So we had the standard design, and just we had randomly around each trap another trap to be able to sample all the distribution of where there can be detected, not just like regular spacing, but having also variability in the spacing of traps. The same is that we also, it's where I learned that it was better to keep the space use constant. And this is a preliminary result for the landscape. And this is also why I didn't much more look in it. It seems, so is it the bias for all the sampling delay for the 4 parameters of the model? So for now, we are assuming that the density is uniform throughout the landscape. So there is no impact of landscape on the density of brown bear, but the landscape is just affecting space use. And from this result, you can see that the 12, the one is orange, the second one, is net bias for all parameters, even for alpha, which is the cost parameter. So the first simulation showed us that the standard design that is usually recommended is also trying nicely to estimate the parameters. This is the coefficient of variations, which means that if you increase the number of traps, you get more precise estimates, but it's not too bad to keep the one with regular spacing. And here is when you compare to different landscapes. And what was funny here was for the landscape C, is the landscape when we have only 0 and 1 as a resistant surface. We don't have variability in the landscape. It's just this suitable area or not suitable area. It's a binary landscape. And in this case, when the resistance is too high, so for the last 4, 5, and 6, when the resistance is the highest, we can see that sometimes the model wasn't able to converge because we didn't have detection on both sides of barriers. And it's maybe something that we have encountered before in the simulation study for the chapter 2, when we have a lot of pixels with no cost. And maybe it shows us that we should have variability in our landscape surface, in the landscape variable that we put in our model to be able to estimate costs. But this is the first preliminary result, and we are also interested to look at if there is correlation between where the individual is living and how he's moving. Maybe it could impact also the results, but we really are looking more deeply in it. But this is the first. But we are, yeah.
Just ask a very naive question about that. So you never consider any opportunistic encounters or citizen science or things that will make control of individuals fully random, I would say, according to the distribution of observers. You always consider a fully planned trap availability.
Yeah, for this first simulation, we try to do the same simulation that was done for the first spatial capture model with Euclidean distance, and just try to validate if this result was still consistent when we added this non-Euclidean distance. But I agree that we need to also maybe do other simulation to look at if the detection probability also vary according to area, with people maybe going more in areas where the bears are present, it affects the results. Yes, it could be something that could be done. For now, this aim.
Do you think that the whole philosophy of your analysis might include this kind of potentially include this kind of data, perhaps with bias and with but there is no strong argument against that?
No.
Can you go back to the bias? You went through that really quickly. I didn't even chance to see.
The 3 landscape or?
Yeah,
this one. So the column are the increasing resistance. So the first column 1 is when the resistance parameter is equal to 0, and then each column is an increasing resistance parameters up to 5, and each line is 1 model parameter, and then we have the 3 landscapes. So it seems to be in average unbiased, except for the resistance parameter for landscape C. But it's also because I didn't remove the simulation that did that converge. So that might be some why we.
This is cool stuff. We need to publish this.
This
is neat.
I did this part of work when I went for 2 weeks in St. Andrews. And it's when I learned a lot about simulations and Euclidean models. I should have finished it during my PhD, but I didn't find the time. But it's a work in progress, and I think I will continue later.
Yeah, very interesting. Well, congratulations for your very great work. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes,
Thank you, Cécile.
So congratulations as well. I really enjoy as always reading your readings, listening to your presentation and collaborating with you during your master and then your PhD. I think it's the same for all the Bloomberg team. I really enjoy that you took time to discuss about the database limitations that you come to the field to see their work and to communicate your results in a pedagogic way. I think it was really nice for us and for also the Bloomberg team, so thank you for that. Yeah, I would like to highlight again that you have really a pedagogic way to explain complex concepts and methods, and it's really nice. You have a really nice illustration, PhD, and really nice animations. I think it's really great for you. It's nice. Yeah, congratulations again. My only regret is about the distribution of your PhD. I would have liked discussion. No, let me see. I just regret that you didn't discuss more the results in the light of other results that were found on Bloomberg connectivity, especially in the Pyrenees. You know, maybe that Nathan Dumortier, a Master 1 student, use expert-based resistance surface and habitat-suitability-based resistance surface combined with linkage mapper and omniscate models to create corridor maps. So I was just wondering, is it easy to compare the maps that he found with the maps you found? Is it the same kind of connectivity you evaluate? Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's one limitation of what I did from my PhD is that I mainly developed the model and I didn't really have time to compare to other models, and what is actually done is most of the time. So yeah, it would have been I think it's possible to match the two, and I think yeah, you use a kind of same of data, so it would definitely be possible to compare the two and to be able to see if what we are estimating throughout these models is also the same result as with other methods. And I think it's something that should be done when we implement, when we want to have to make management decisions, to use different approaches and to look at if they give the same results, maybe we can be more confident about them. But this is something that I could have done in that's nice.
Could you discuss a bit about what kind of internal and environmental factors can impact road resistance or landscape resistance? For instance, road characteristics or individual characteristics. So do you know what you expect?
Yeah, definitely we expect that the road might impact brown bear in different ways, especially when we have a highway with a barrier along the highway. It's maybe impossible for bear to be able to cross it, and maybe much more stressful because the traffic is higher there, and there is it's much less likely than maybe on a smaller scale road. And when I use the distance to major road, we have kind of also differences in the type of road that I put as input of the model. So yeah, it would be interesting also to look at differences, and maybe we can expect that if the traffic intensity is higher, or maybe there is differences, maybe if the bear are crossed during the night, with this kind of data we can have clues or when they are really crossing different kind of roads. Maybe the landscape around the road, but also impact differently. There is this area at the western part of near Biella, when we know that the brand are not really likely to go on the other parts. And we do not, in this area, there is the road, there is a river, there is a train line, there is houses, and maybe there is not, we are saying that it's just the impact of the road, but maybe the cumulative impact of different factors that might locally impact the movement of the bears. And internally factors, maybe there is like I said, maybe there is age factors with when they have to find a new place to live, they may be able to move across areas of lesser quality of what brown bear with this food resource area are. And maybe also with females and with cubs or without cubs, maybe there is also differences in connectivity. So yes, wait, I can think of. There is I think there is a paper that was looking at is there a bald bear or not, and I think I don't know to which scale, but maybe there is some individuals which have personality and they may be more okay to cross unsuitable area. And yes, maybe there is this kind of effect.
In your introduction, you talk about genetic methods to resistant surface. Do you think genetic data from the Pyrenean brown bear can be used to infer connectivity?
I think that something I didn't present here is yeah. And I think I'm not sure, but what is done is genetic connectivity is that you can use a genetic distance between the location as proxy of isolation and relate it to the geographical distance. And maybe we could integrate this genetic distance. But I was also thinking that in the Pyrenees, as the population is quite young and mainly made of reintroduced bear, maybe the genetic distance that we will compute may not reflect really the population. But I don't really know this method. I think it may be tricky in this case. Maybe in 10 years or 50 years, it will be possible.
Yes.
You mentioned in your PhD that accurate modeling of connecting paths likely fall in the continuum between surface knowledge and the landscape structure. So this means that memory probably play a role in movement and connectivity. And do you think our data in the Pyrenees can be used to investigate this question?
I was thinking of that. I was discussing with Pierre. He was saying, yeah, but they don't really have one activity center because they are following the food resources along the year, and maybe there can be some area during the spring, and then in summer, then in another area, and maybe we could. Is there enough detection per individual? But I'm not sure. We could look at movement of activity center, but within the year, to look at how they are moving throughout to follow the food resources throughout the year. Maybe we could look at if the following years these movements are repeating, meaning that they likely go to the same spots over the year. So maybe we could look at this information, but it would mean that we will have a lot of detection per individual. But maybe it's
because for your information, there is a project that will start soon in collaboration with Nathan Rank in Marie. And his plan is to use GPS data from translocated individuals
as naive individuals to look at the role of memory in the formation of orange and infer connectivity. That would be interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, super cool.
And, can you explain what are the challenges about broader connectivity in the Pyrenees?
I mainly presented, but for the aim of the presentation, that we wanted to know connectivity for space use and for internal movements. But this presentation, I have to acknowledge that it was mainly for going afterwards to the full chapter when I'm looking at space use processes and internal movement processes. But I think the main challenge for the Pyrenees is mainly genetic challenges, to have reproductions that appears in the eastern part of the Pyrenees, but it's already happened with Sorita having cuts recently. So having this information of reproductions may be the most interesting thing part of this kind of theoretical models. So I think the main challenges was to be able to begin to have reproductions also in the other part of the Pyrenees.
Yeah, it's because I think you ignored the genetic challenge in your PhD and
yeah.
I think the main challenge relating to connectivity is about the connection between the two pores and also genetic mixing because of high consanguinity and low genetic diversity. And the low perspective to have new transformations.
Yeah, it was a little bit addressed in the third article when we looked at the males would like to move across the nucleus, and then the female doesn't seem to be able to do so, but with all the limitations that we didn't look at for age or for differences in behavior. But
yeah. Do you think your results provide answer about why female, for instance, didn't manage to cross among the two poles?
I'm not sure that we can reach a level of understanding why. The presence of here, this is road, but they may be correlated with other landscape variables, seems to restrict not be able to move across larger area, to be able to move. But maybe it's just because we didn't detect the female doing this kind of long distance dispersal that may make it possible. I don't know.
May I ask a question? Because it's sort of that's a culmination, I guess, of various questions that have, I think, poked at us a little bit already. And obviously, I think you're preaching a little bit to the choir here about hierarchical models. You know, I think most of us use these in one form or another, capture market capture. We understand the benefits of not ignoring the fact that you miss some individuals. But I'm going to turn this around and I'm going to ask you, in the case, for instance, of the Pyrenees bears, would people have been better off just capturing a few of these guys, putting more GPS colors on them, and just seeing what they're actually doing? So by not ignoring the fact that you missed individuals, you ended up with a model. You ended up being able to say that you're drawing population level inferences. You also admitted to us that there were some questionable results because simply the model has to make some assumptions that in some cases are just too simplistic. So this is a tongue-in-cheek question, you know. I obviously trying to provoke you a little bit here. So, and I still think you did the right thing. But I'm going to ask you: would it have been better to gone in, capture half the population? That's not very many bears, you know, or even a quarter of them, and just put GPS colors on them. And yes, it's an expense, but it's also expensive to do this year after year with this monitoring. Would you have gotten different, better results, worse results? What's your feel?
I think that if we were able to do that, we could have like much finer scale movement data, which provides a lot of results that are and of information that may be better suited for the question that we have in hand. But the thing that I have in mind that it's not because you have GPS data that you can't use hierarchical models. Like you can still have GPS data and acknowledge for the fact that you detect only a part of the population, propagate the uncertainty with some assumption, and just going to the points that you also provide connectivity uncertainty maps while having GPS data. And this kind of the work that people are doing by combining movement models with spatial capture models, with modeling the movement of activity centers throughout the year. And I think that for looking at more fine-scale movement processes, that combining different types of data and including like other models into a hierarchical framework might give like uncertainty and give us clues. So it might be, it's not because you have GPS data that you can do hierarchy.
Like to detect, to calculate detectability. If you put your GPS data into the model, you could perhaps calibrate your detectability.
Yes, also. Yeah. If you have GPS data, you could answer to yeah. But I'm not sure that.
I'm Maëlis Kervellec. I just want to mention, because of your question about the risk of depredation, we didn't do that, but we use spatial density from Maëlis master to infer the risk of human bear on crickets across the landscape, and so yeah, it was really useful to use this result this way.
Okay, thank you. So it should be my turn. I will have a very few questions. In fact, many things have been already asked. So once again, I'm not very original, but I would like to congratulate you for the quality of your talk and document. But an additional argument is that, with your permission, I would really like to use some of your papers and elements of your thesis for my next course on population viability and CMR modeling. So it will be soon in December. So thank you very much for helping me to improve my 20-year-old CMR course. So I have read some very naive questions for me, because I'm not so keen on methodologies. First of all, so you started by discussing your method and concept that you wanted to address by your modeling improvement, and after that you moved to your biological system where you wanted to crash test that, I would say. But do you think that this kind of approach is mostly dedicated to terrestrial species? It was already asked by, I think, already or perhaps Angela, but I'm personally mostly working on birds, and I think that there are many things that are useful and similar, but at the same time, there are some hypotheses that may be a bit different, particularly concerning the level of the omniscience that we consider or not in the ability of the individuals to know their environment or not, or in the model or in the real world, and concerning also the scale of the processes that you consider if it is a one-day movement or dispersal or things like that. So, for example, I think about birds that are likely to visit different places before dispersing and doing an actual movement to population at the population size. So what about that? Do you think that your questions and focus were mostly driven by the fact that you were working on terrestrial mammals, or do you think that they are far more generic than that?
I think that the way I approached this was really because it was terrestrial mammals affected by landscape structures, not moving in some restricted areas, like having a on range, and because it is the assumptions of spatial capture models, which are based on point process models, But for birds, I don't really know much about their ecology, but I think that maybe they are less impacted by directly the landscape structure. Maybe they're following like aerial currents, or I don't know. Also the fact that some species are migrating. So if you are looking at the data for 1 year, they are migrating over large areas. So I'm not sure that having just capture data would be enough to inform this kind of processes. And it just depends on which scale you are looking.
But in fact, my point was on the method of learning, but also on the biological assumptions, in fact, that are beyond this model.
But it could, like for, it is okay for terrestrial mammal, but I was thinking a researcher that contacted me wanted to apply it on larval dispersal and wanted to include in the model a current flow model within the ocean to look at the dispersal of fish. So in this case, it could be interesting to have this kind of model that include current flow into the colonization process of invasive species, for example.
Could be perhaps also even for seed
yes.
dispersal in plants.
So in this case, having like a current model inside the model could also help.
I was just talking to someone about that, by the way, and thinking, so in the example with the current flow, like with fish, they have different rates of movement upstream versus downstream. And so like if you were thinking about the sigma value, you have like an upstream sigma and a downstream sigma. Kind of cool thinking about it.
Once again, a very stupid question, but perhaps I missed an enormous part of your work, but I didn't see too much discussion of connection with multi-event modeling. So is it the case, or is it not the case, or is it do you think is discussed in terms of multi-event modeling? Because some of the discussion by Richard, I think, were almost touching that, but perhaps
I'm not sure that I'm clear about believing that during the life of the individual.
I mean the fact that we discriminate the state, what is the biological state of the ecological processes that you are looking at or studying, and the event of the control event or the capture event that you have in your capture mark recycling. All this multi-event modeling that you develop for survival rates and things like that. So I think that the philosophy that made so much differences between the classical philosophy of CMR and multi-event, even if it goes to the same kind of aims, change the philosophy of the way we approach that from a methodological point of view. I think that sometimes I wonder if it might be useful to use this kind of philosophy in that context or not. Or is it totally stupid?
I was wondering about the multi-state models actually, and just in the sense, because you said you had some problems with identifiability in the end when you try to do this, latent group or distinction models for instance, for groups of individuals that were strongly affected by some environment which those that really didn't seem to care, right? And or the individuals that dispersed further than other individuals. And we're seeing this right now, and one thing that we're finding is that it helps you constrain things better. If the model knows that it's not like anybody can go at any time, but it's essentially a rare event, like you guys were saying, it's a rare event. This happens maybe once in a lifetime, that they do these long movements where they may not care about it, they might use this highway to move on, right? And so in a way, by using a model that model states explicitly, you can sort of force and say, well, it's going to happen. They're first going to start out in some state where they're not doing this, and then they're going to do it. You don't know when, but they're going to do it. And then once they're done with that, they're done. And that actually could make it identifiable, even if you don't have information about age, for instance. So that's the only thing I can think of right now. But,
Just a comment on your question. I feel like these connectivity models are kind of in their infancy, and your question kind of gets at that. It's like, what are we actually trying to do, right? And like ultimately we care about fitness, but there's so many like intermediate steps I feel like we could be exploring. And like one of them is, you know, we think about landscape resistance, but you know, it's more than just the landscape structure that's influencing the movement. And maybe have you thought about like competition, like others, you know, competition with other species? And you actually have a lot of data on that from like camera trapping data on other species. And you think about co-occurrence models, and it's like co-occurrence of other species and interference competition could be influencing, you know, movement on the landscape, and integrating these kind of co-occurrence models. And like one example, you know, with your road, not with the brown bears, but like if you think about another example with like coyotes and foxes, where coyotes exclude foxes from their home ranges, and coyotes actually establish home ranges on the edges of roads. And so if you have roads, it might not actually be the road, it might be the influence of coyotes excluding foxes, right? And so like thinking about those kinds of things, I think would be really interesting.
Maybe the case for the brown bear, like females with cubs, like avoiding males, for instance, and going to less suitable habitat because they are just avoiding them.
So even within the same species,
Yeah.
exactly, you know, density effects like you.
In fact, it goes with my next question, because I think that this matter of resistance was a little bit like of theoretical niche and realized niche, where you have some kind of theoretical resistance and the actual resistance matched by all the.
Maybe we are overestimating the resistance parameter because other factors are influencing their movement. We assume that it is because in the model it only includes the distance to the road. We assume that this is the road that is influencing the movement, and maybe other factors that might influence the movement.
And finally, I did really appreciate the point that you made about this matter of two bears that move a lot compared to the others, and the fact that according to the scale, to the kind of questions you have to consider them or not. I think working particularly on translocations, including bears, but not only, we always have this matter, and this is a general issue in conservation, but particularly for this kind of translocation. We always work with very small number of individuals, which at the beginning are just a sum of anecdotes, I would say, of very single events that occur one by one, and don't know how to interpret that. Is it a rule? Just an accident? And your ability to manage that, to reincorporate kind of things that are just outliers, but that remain the truth, or if truth is still a word to use today in the present world. That will be my next question. So I did really appreciate that, and I think that the philosophy that you have at that level could be extended and used in a larger scale than this issue about modeling movements and things like that. This is a general issue, I think, also in demography, and that individual things make sense when you have a small sample. It doesn't make sense for genericity, but it makes sense for the actual situation. And we are in the statistical limits that we have. Of course, there is a Bayesian stuff to cope with, to try to cope with that. But anyway, we are still fighting against that or with that, and it's not so easy. So thank you for your contribution for that. And so also my very last question was about this matter of, but it was already asked by other members of the jury, the fact that we as scientists go further and further on this, the quality of this interpretation and the quality of the data, etc. And since particularly these conservation issues, but this is not only that area, but that controversies are finally not so much about the quality of your estimators. I mean, in terms of the fact that you use the right method or not, the controversies, even concerning these big animals, if we stay in the field,
about the kind of truth that people are ready to accept or not and to consider. So how do you feel about that? And probably the very tricky questions, but
tricky question. Yeah, maybe just we are trying to provide maps as well as uncertainty maps, but we don't know if the people that are deciding understand them first. Okay, you're not sure about it, so you're not sure about anything, or so. But I think that is, even though we are acknowledging for the fact that we are not sure about what we are talking about, I think it's better to say it, because it's reinforces the fact that for some part we are sure, like acknowledging that sometimes we are not sure, so that it's reinforcing when we know. And I think that for this part, providing the uncertainty, for instance, is a nice addition, but it also means that we have to communicate about what is important and why it's not only diminishing our confidence about results, because when we only provide one connectivity maps or one distribution maps to say, oh, but that's perfect, you know everything, it's here. So it's one thing. So yeah, I believe that it's not only by providing complex models that we can achieve management of population, coexistence with wildlife, for instance. It's much more complex because it's involving people, and because it involves people, it's not just about models and so that we are giving. So yeah, the true management is, I think it might involve much complex things.
thank you. So I think it's time to listen to your supervisors.
Yeah. Do we wait for people to come in? No, this is just us. Okay, so then I will. I do it in English. So I have one question for you. It's an easy one. What if, no, maybe not tomorrow, because tomorrow I guess you're gonna be resting, but next week, let's say Monday or Tuesday, you would have to start your PhD again. Would you do something differently?
Or
change supervisor. Yeah.
I'm not sure that I will do a lot of things differently, because I did this thing in this order that I arrived at this point of doing class. But if I want to go deep, maybe I would want to do the simulation that I didn't do at the beginning, because some choices that I did afterwards would have, I think, changed. No, I think that's like doing the things this way is what leads me to this result. So I think I will say that.
Du coup, je me souviens de la première fois que j'ai reçu un email d'Olivier. Il m'a dit ah, j'ai une super étudiante en Master 1, elle a fait un travail incroyable, ça te dirait d'être son co-superviseur pour son stage de Master 2. Et puis là, je me suis vite rendu compte que bah ouais, t'as des super capacités, et puis c'est ce que je disais, j'en avais parlé à Richard à l'époque, un peu pour moi, je me dis, c'est pas une étudiante en Master 2, c'est une étudiante de thèse, quoi. Des super capacités, elle comprend super vite, t'intègres très vite tout ce qu'on te dit, on fait souvent un peu plus même de ce qu'on te dit, et puis t'as cette capacité de discussion critique aussi sur ce qu'on dit. Et ouais, c'était vraiment génial d'être, je dirais même pas de superviser, parce qu'en fait, j'ai l'impression de travailler avec toi, réellement, vraiment du travail, donc ça, c'était top. En plus, t'es vraiment une chouette personne, c'est vraiment agréable de travailler avec toi, t'es souriante, tu diffuses la positivité autour de toi, donc c'est vraiment super. Ouais, c'est à moi de te remercier pour avoir travaillé, d'avoir accepté d'être dans le comité de thèse, quoi. Donc merci à toi. Je veux aussi remercier Olivier de m'avoir invité comme superviseur. Sans lui, ça serait jamais arrivé et c'était vraiment top. Donc voilà, ce que je voulais dire là. Ouais, du coup, je voulais te féliciter pour ton travail. Tu as fait un super travail, une super thèse. On a tous entendu des commentaires positifs de tout le monde. Donc, tu peux vraiment être fier de toi. Et puis, j'espère que tu vas rester dans le monde de la recherche, même si c'est parfois un peu difficile, parce qu'on a besoin de plus de personnes comme toi. Et puis aussi, égoïstement, j'aimerais bien pouvoir continuer à travailler avec toi, si c'est possible. Donc, ouais, j'espère que tu resteras dans ce monde de la recherche. Et puis, encore une fois, félicitations. Merci.
Moi? So I will switch to French, but Angela and Richard have the 4 pages that written for you. So get ready. At least there is no question. Ok, donc je suis très heureux d'être là aujourd'hui. Alors merci à toutes et à tous pour votre présence, ici dans la salle, donc d'être vous. Ok, et sur YouTube aussi, j'espère qu'il y a encore des gens, je pense. Merci à notre équipe, évidemment. Merci à tous les membres du jury d'être venus, d'avoir fait des déplacements, parfois de très loin. Merci aux membres du comité de thèse de Maëlis, on les a pas remerciés, mais il y avait Claude Millot, Eve Afondo, Nicolas Verne, Fridolin Zimmerman, Cécile était là, et Sarah Beaulieu aussi. J'en profite pour dire merci à l'OFB, à l'Office français de la biodiversité. Alors, il y a eu un soutien financier, mais c'est surtout aux collègues de l'OFB que je voudrais dire merci pour les collaborations, et en particulier à Cécile, qui est ici aujourd'hui, à Pierrick Quenette, à Jérôme Santi, pour le source, et puis à Christophe Duchamp, Nolwenn Doué-Auguet, et puis à Delphine Chanousseau aussi, qui était dans le club, et qui nous ont accompagnés pour cette école. Voilà. Merci à Richard pour avoir accueilli Maëlis en Norvège, et à Chris Sutherland pour l'avoir accueilli en Écosse, où il a été voilà, merci à tous les deux. Alors j'ai encore plein de remerciements, mais je vais m'arrêter là. Je vais parler de Maëlis, quoi. Alors, je vais vous donner un peu de contexte. Alors, la première fois que j'ai rencontré Maëlis, c'était il y a 5 ans. Alors, dans mes mails, j'ai pu dater le premier échange au 19 octobre 2019. Donc, ça fait 5 ans, un peu plus de 5 ans. Et tu m'avais envoyé un mail, c'était une candidature spontanée pour un stage de M1. Alors, j'en prends un point. Je ne fais pas souvent ça, mais là, je ne sais pas ce qui m'a pris. Enfin, si, je sais ce qui m'a pris. En fait, tu as un double parcours tu as fait une licence biologie maths. Et puis, tu avais fait pas mal de stages, et puis, dont au Canada, et puis, il y avait une lettre de. Je lis jamais les lettres de motivation, par exemple. Mais la tienne, elle était, je crois, je l'ai lue, et elle m'a bien plu. Voilà, donc, on s'est dit, bah, pourquoi pas. Alors, j'ai discuté avec les collègues de l'EFD, et ils étaient partants, et puis, on s'est dit, tiens, on va proposer un sujet sur l'étude d'un système prédateur 3 avec le lynx, on en a parlé aujourd'hui, le chamois et le chevreuil. C'est des données qui étaient récoltées par des pièges photos, et que tu as analysé grâce à un modèle d'occupancy, donc comme tu as montré aujourd'hui, mais qui était multi-espèces. Alors, on peut mentionner, on y a pensé au début d'ailleurs de faire multi-espèces, on en avait parlé avec Aurélie. Et l'objectif, c'est de faire la part des interactions entre espèces et des préférences d'habitat de ces espèces. Et au passage, je remercie, alors j'ai fini, mais je n'ai pas fini. Je remercie Jean-Baptiste Fanjouge, qui a aussi accompagné ce stage. Et alors, on en avait discuté sur Skype. Alors, on parlait encore de Skype à l'époque. Et puis c'était entendu, donc on y va. Donc le rendez-vous est pris, c'était début mars. Donc début mars, on est en 2020. Et en 2020, il s'est passé un truc. Et on se souvient tous de ce qui s'est passé. Hein. Donc on se voit rapidement à la barrière de l'entrée du campus. Donc c'était là, je te raconte plein de fois. Ça m'a marqué en fait. Et on se voit là, et puis le CNRS décide de fermer, de tout fermer. Et puis l'université en même temps. Donc tout est fermé en fait. Donc ça c'était début mars, je crois. Et donc là, en fait, c'est le début du confinement. Donc, c'est un stage en télétravail, hein. Enfin, c'est un stage en visio, quoi. Donc, tu pars en Bretagne et tu vas rejoindre ta famille. Et c'est ta famille qui occupe une grande place dans ton cœur, là, Nathalie. Voilà. Alors, pendant ce stage, moi, j'ai découvert quelqu'un de très organisé, de sérieux, d'autonome. Alors, c'est des qualités, souvent on dit c'est un peu ennuyeux, mais en fait, c'est hyper important. Une grosse capacité de travail, quelqu'un qui aimait l'écologie et les stats, c'est pas souvent qu'il y avait les deux. Et puis, moi, je découvre aussi quelqu'un de humble, quelqu'un avec qui il est très facile d'interagir, de discuter, de travailler. Et alors, la finance, elle a lieu en juillet 2020. Et alors, j'avais écrit un truc à l'époque, il fallait faire une évaluation. Je pense que tu l'as jamais vu, cette évaluation. Ouais. Non, je pense que tu l'as jamais vue. Donc, je vais te la dire parce que c'était prémonitoire quand même. Tu l'as jamais vu, hein? Non, je l'ai jamais vu. Donc c'est une évaluation que je devais envoyer au responsable du master. Donc, j'ai dit, Maëlis est une étudiante formidable. Outre son humilité, elle s'intéresse, elle est à l'écoute, elle comprend vite. Elle fait preuve d'initiative, elle a d'excellentes capacités. C'est un M1, hein, juste je replace un contexte. C'était en M1. Je m'étais emballé, mais j'ai raison quand même. Elle a d'excellentes capacités d'analyse et elle rédige bien. Son niveau est excellent pour une étudiante de M1, et là je pense qu'on est d'accord avec Cyril. Et nous avions souvent l'impression de travailler avec une stagiaire de M2, voire parfois avec quelqu'un en début de thèse. J'ai mis un point d'exclamation. Alors, si le confinement n'a pas affecté le sujet des stages, parce que c'était plutôt de la modélisation, elle a su mettre à profit son temps pour faire plus que ce à quoi nous attendions. Il y a d'ailleurs une partie du travail qui n'a pas été intégrée dans le rapport, d'ailleurs tu l'as refait dans la thèse. Sa marge de progression est grande et nous avons hâte, parce que je signe aussi pour les collègues de l'OFP, de suivre ses prochaines aventures. Alors ça, c'est la période de confinement. C'est aussi nos fameuses pauses Zoom avec Gilles, Valentin et d'autres qui nous rejoignaient pendant le confinement, en fait. Donc on a des photos, mais qu'on ne montrera pas là. Donc cet esprit un peu propre à l'équipe. Alors ensuite, pour le M2, tu voulais partir à l'étranger. Alors on en discute un peu avec Richard, qui était prêt à t'accueillir. Et j'ai pas eu de mal d'ailleurs, enfin on n'a pas eu de mal avec Cyril le convaincre. Mais les responsables du M2 te conseillent et nous conseillent que tu restes en France et que tu ne partes pas à l'étranger, hein, à cause de la situation sanitaire. Et ils ont eu raison en fait, parce qu'après il y a eu encore des histoires. Bon bref, donc on part plutôt sur un projet avec l'équipe bourse. Et tout de suite continue, on y va et tout, en collaboration avec Richard et avec Cyril, et toute l'équipe, donc les modèles de l'application grand carnivore, voilà. Donc voilà, encore une fois, Cyril est déjà là, hein. C'était chouette de t'apporter le début, et j'ai pas fini avec. Donc on a une réunion tous ensemble le 18 septembre. Ah mais j'ai pas fini, j'ai 4 pages. Hein. Attends, c'est une fois. Donc le 18 septembre, c'est aussi le jour. Alors ça, je t'ai jamais dit. J'ai envoyé un message à Christophe et Nolwenn, et je leur ai dit, je pense que je te l'avais jamais dit. Pour commencer à réfléchir à une thèse pour toi. Donc j'avais dit, ah oui, 18 septembre. Ouais. Tu commençais ton M2 et aux possibilités de financement surtout. Je n'avais pas laissé échapper. Donc c'est aussi ta première conférence avec Roland, tu te souviens, c'est quand même une première conférence. Bon, c'était en vidéo, mais c'était en octobre 2020. Il a présenté le résultat de l'année. Bon, là, j'avance un peu, enfin, juste en janvier 2021. Et là, je voulais juste mentionner le rôle de Cyril, parce que là, tu as commencé à t'impliquer encore plus. C'est ça. Ouais, là, c'est ça. Pas sur les aspects méthodologie, mais aussi sur les questions d'écologie. Moi, des fois, je suis un peu léger. Hein, et sur l'accompagnement plus généralement. Hein. Donc, j'en profite pour te remercier. Merci pour tout. Merci pour Maëlis. Merci pour toute l'aide, tout le soutien, pour partager tout ce que tu sais. Hein, c'est vraiment, voilà, pour ta gentillesse, ton humilité. Voilà, c'est hyper facile de travailler avec toi et c'est rare et c'est agréable. Donc, voilà, je voulais le dire. C'est une petite parenthèse pour toi. Donc, là, on regarde Maëlis. C'est pas fini. Donc là, on est en février 2021. Ça va aller, hein, je vais y arriver. Donc février 2021, si je ne suis pas trop ému avant la fin. Donc ça fait plusieurs semaines qu'on travaille sur un projet de thèse aussi, que je dois faire remonter à l'école doctorale pour que tu puisses candidater dessus. Donc c'est toi et seulement toi, hein, on n'allait pas faire candidater plein de gens, c'est évident. Donc dans ce projet, on parle de grands carnivores, d'ours, de lynx, pas de loup pour une fois. Des données non invasives, de combinaisons de données, de connectivité, bon, un peu finalement ce que tu as fait. Hein. Il y a un peu de suivi transfrontalier aussi, donc j'en profite, tu l'as mentionné avec les collègues espagnols, hein, merci à eux. Et puis il y a aussi les collègues suisses pour le lynx qui ont contribué. Voilà, donc je les remercie. Alors pendant le stage de M2, tout se passe comme sur des roulettes, tu impressionnes encore, tu montres une efficacité redoutable, tu comprends tout, vite. Alors je vais insister plusieurs fois là-dessus, mais tu as une facilité dans les échanges aussi, dans le fait de avec les gens. Quoi. Et ça, c'est hyper important. Donc après tout s'accélère, tu envoies ta candidature en mai à l'école doctorale, tu soutiens ton M2 le 10 juin avec brio. Il y a Bertrand Cloès qui n'avait pas en départ. Le 29 juin, tu passes l'école doctorale et le 2 juillet, on a la bonne nouvelle. Et j'ai tout retrouvé. Le 2 juillet, on a la bonne nouvelle, tu es classé, tu as décroché un contrat électoral. Donc là, bon, bah, les espaces, et après, on se retrouve à la rentrée à l'automne 2021. Et là, on s'était un peu emballé parce qu'on avait 7 chapitres. On avait 7 chapitres de thèse. Bon, on était conscient qu'il fallait en lâcher un. Et bon, finalement, on en abandonnera 2. Et on a été bien inspirés parce qu'en fait, il y a d'autres gens qui ont bien invité et qui ont publié dessus. Donc, c'était pas mal. Voilà. Il y a un autre chapitre qu'on a lâché et qu'on a remplacé par autre chose. Que tu n'as pas eu le temps de faire. Finalement, tu as eu le temps de détailler grâce à la question de revenu. Et c'était un point important avec les simulations pour le dire. Donc, c'est une autre de tes qualités. Hein. Tu as plein d'idées, tu as des ressources. Bon, j'ai presque fini, hein, mais il y a tellement à dire. Dépend de la page. Alors, ah oui, j'ai presque fini. Non, il me reste une page, c'est bon. Mais c'est la page où il faut que je tienne le coup, parce que sinon je vais être trop vite. Alors, pendant cette thèse, tu auras pas mal voyagé aussi. C'était quelque chose qui était important pour toi, je crois. Alors, il y a eu la Norvège avec le séjour dans l'équipe de Richard. Il y a eu l'Écosse, on l'a dit, avec le groupe de Chris Sutherland en 2023. Il y a eu le Pays de Galles, il y a eu l'Afrique du Sud avec des conférences, il y a eu d'autres choses aussi. Alors, pendant ces voyages, tu as rencontré plein de gens, des tas de gens pendant cette thèse. Je pense que c'est important aussi pour toi. C'est encore une autre de tes qualités. Tu travailles facilement dans des groupes, dans des collectifs. Et ça, c'est la recherche aujourd'hui, hein, c'est avec les autres. Mais c'est pas que ça. Je pense que c'est aussi quelque chose que tu aimes. Vous ne serez pas tout seul pour toi. Voilà. Donc, alors, ce gros travail que tu as fait, et puis ces collaborations, tu les as cultivées, et elles ont mené à plusieurs publications scientifiques. Alors, voilà. Il y a 2 articles déjà publiés, c'est quand même remarquable en fin de thèse. Il y en a un qui est en révision, un autre qui est quasi prêt à être soumis, et il y a celui sur les simulations qu'il faut écrire, mais c'est une autoroute. Voilà, alors, non, c'est des trucs qu'il faut que je tienne. Donc pour moi, tu es une personne très importante pour le groupe. Tu es une personne sur laquelle on peut se reposer et sur laquelle on peut compter. Tu ne veux pas savoir combien c'est agréable, combien c'est rassurant de t'avoir dans le groupe, toujours disponible, présente et prête à aider. Alors, là j'ai fait une pause. En plus de ton travail de recherche, tu as enseigné aussi. C'est une petite pause, pas que ce soit premier. Tu as aussi montré un fort intérêt pour la vulgarisation scientifique. Alors, tu n'as pas eu le temps de le montrer, mais en 3e année, tu n'as pas enseigné, tu as choisi de rejoindre l'équipe de Thierry Brassac, qui dirige le service communication à l'université, pour travailler sur une outil de visualisation des données de polluchologie. Il fallait que je le place. Vous chercherez ce que c'est. C'est une science qui a de l'avenir. Voilà, tu as aussi contribué et tu as écrit des textes pour communiquer sur tes travaux pendant ta thèse. C'est des choses qu'on ne voit pas, mais qui prennent du temps et qui sont importantes pour les scientifiques aujourd'hui. Voilà, donc je pourrais continuer, mais ça va être un peu long pour tout le monde. Donc je vais conclure en disant ceci. Je conclue. Alors pour moi, tu incarnes une nouvelle génération de chercheuses. Une nouvelle génération de chercheurs et chercheurs en écologie statistique. Voilà. Moi, je suis heureux pour la. C'est un peu ce qu'il a dit aussi. Hein, je suis heureux pour notre communauté qui existe en fait. Et à titre personnel maintenant, alors moi j'ai été très très chanceux j'ai été extrêmement chanceux parce que je t'ai vu du premier jour à cette barrière de campus hein, et jusqu'à aujourd'hui dans cette amphi. Et j'ai eu la chance pendant 5 ans de voir s'épanouir une scientifique qui est brillante, enfin plusieurs personnes, et puis surtout une belle personne. Voilà. Donc tu pars pas tout de suite. Et je ferai tout ce que je peux pour que tu reviennes à Montpellier, ça c'est sûr. Tu vas me manquer, et je te souhaite le meilleur. Voilà.
Merci beaucoup. So I think it's time now to close the discussion. So thank you very much, Maëlis. Merci beaucoup pour cette discussion. Donc là, le jury va devoir délibérer. On va demander de bien vouloir à nouveau de goûter. Je ne vais pas pour très longtemps. Rester à proximité a priori. On a quelques formalités à remplir et discussions à mener. Et puis on vous rappelle dès que possible.
Céline, tu restes avec nous, hein?